Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. It was a quiet evening when I first noticed it. A whisper, just out of reach of the wind. A soft murmur that made me pause, my feet halting at the edge of the riverbank. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow on the surface of the water, but the air around me felt colder than it should have been. Have you ever stopped, right in the middle of a walk, to listen to something that didn't belong? I wasn't sure if it was the sound of the water flowing over the rocks or something else. But it tugged at me, like a voice calling from beneath the surface, a voice so familiar, yet so strange. For a moment, I thought it might have been my imagination. After all, it was just a quiet evening, and there were no people around, only the gentle rush of the river. But then, the voice repeated itself. I hadn't said anything out loud. No words had escaped my lips, yet somehow the voice in the water mimicked my own. It was as though it had pulled the very sound of my thoughts from the air and woven them into the currents of the river. I took a step closer, straining to hear more clearly. The voice came again, clear and unmistakable. "Turn back," it said. It was exactly what I had thought moments before, just before the whispers began. It was as if the river had echoed my own hesitation. My heart began to race, but I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my breath shallow. I wanted to look away, to dismiss it as some odd trick of the light or the wind, but the voice, so eerily similar to my own, held me captive. I stared at the water. The ripples danced on the surface, yet beneath them, there was something else. I should have left right then, but curiosity had already grabbed hold of me. What was this? Why was the river speaking in my voice? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or had I stumbled upon something far stranger, far darker than I could ever understand? The breeze picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, but the voice, my voice, kept repeating. Each word it spoke seemed to pull me further into the mystery, deeper into the pull of the river's strange, cold call. And then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it clearly. "You'll stay, won't you?" The voice wasn't an echo of my own thoughts anymore. It was a question, a promise, and something else, something far more sinister. I didn't answer, but somehow, I knew that my steps had already been decided for me. The water had already spoken. And I couldn't leave now. How does it feel when a place you know suddenly turns unfamiliar? When the sounds that should be comforting, like the rush of a river, become unsettling, like they're hiding something? That was the feeling creeping up my spine as I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear myself away from the riverbank. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was the solitude getting to me. But the voice, it was too clear, too real to ignore. I took another step toward the water, my feet heavy as if something was pulling me in. The sky was now darkening, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I felt as though the world around me had shifted, leaving me in a space that no longer felt safe. I bent down, peering into the water, but all I saw were reflections. My face, distorted in the ripples, stared back at me, except something was wrong. My reflection didn't look like me. It was smiling. I froze. I blinked, hoping the strange vision would disappear, but it didn't. The reflection, my reflection, was still there, grinning at me from the water, its eyes glinting with an odd, knowing light. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was unsettling, like it knew something I didn't. I leaned closer, the cold air prickling my skin, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. The reflection didn't move with me. It stayed in that eerie grin, locked in place, while I slowly drew back, unable to take my eyes off of it. My heart pounded in my chest, and I suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to look away, to run, to escape this nightmare. But I couldn't. My feet were heavy, my legs refusing to obey my commands. And then it spoke. "Why are you afraid?" The words came from the water, but they weren't spoken by the reflection. No, it was my own voice again, the same voice that had whispered from the river earlier. My blood ran cold. I turned my head quickly, scanning the empty space around me, but I saw no one. No one, except for the shadow of the trees growing longer in the dimming light. I took a step back, trying to move away from the water, but I was rooted to the spot. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder, as if the voice were coming from inside my head. It wasn't just an echo, it was a command. A presence. "You shouldn't leave," it said, more insistent now. "Stay with us. You belong here." The words twisted in my mind. Who was speaking? Was this some sort of trick, a hallucination brought on by fatigue? Or was something more sinister at work? I looked down at the water, my reflection still grinning at me, but now it was different. It wasn't just smiling, it was moving. It was bending its arms, twisting in a way that my own body didn't. I gasped, stepping back, and that's when I heard it. A sound, footsteps, echoing behind me, though the ground around me was empty. My breath caught in my throat. The sound grew louder, closer, as if someone, or something, was approaching. But when I turned, there was nothing. Except for the water. The voices were becoming harder to ignore now, more insistent, like an unseen force was pulling at me, tugging me toward the river. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away from this unnatural place, but my feet were still planted. The water lapped gently at the shore, but beneath it, something else stirred. I could hear it clearly now, my own words, repeated back at me, distorted and warped. "You can't leave. You've already said it." I wasn't sure if I was hearing the river speak, or if the voices were in my head, a maddening mix of reality and nightmare. Every part of me screamed to break free, to turn and run as far away as possible. But still, I stood there, trembling, as the whispers continued to crawl under my skin. The reflection in the water, the one that wasn't mine, was still there, watching me, waiting for something. What did it want? The ground beneath me felt softer now, almost as if the earth itself was shifting, giving way to the weight of something unseen. A sound like a distant breath echoed through the air, and the trees around me seemed to lean closer, their branches twisting like fingers. I couldn't escape the sensation that the world was closing in, that I was no longer alone, that the river had claimed me. I turned my head again. The voice in my mind, growing stronger now, was almost a chant, repeating those same words over and over, becoming a maddening rhythm. "You can't leave. You've already said it." And for a moment, I wasn't sure if I had said those words aloud, or if they were the voice of the water echoing through the darkening night. The reflection grinned wider, as if it knew my thoughts. "Stay," it whispered, and the words seemed to drag me deeper into the river's pool. "Stay with us." And then, from the darkness beyond the water's edge, a figure stepped forward. I didn't see it at first. The figure was there, just out of my direct line of sight, standing in the shadows. But I could feel it, presence. The air thickened, pressing in around me like something alive, something hungry. My breath quickened, and for the first time, I felt the overwhelming urge to flee, to escape this place before it consumed me. But my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen, like the water's grip had seeped into my very bones. The figure in the shadows stepped forward, the faintest outline of a silhouette cutting through the dusk. It wasn't clear, not completely, just a dark shape, tall, thin, with the barest hint of something glistening in the moonlight. For a moment, it almost seemed like a reflection of myself, distorted and incomplete. But it wasn't. It moved, slow and deliberate, until it stood at the edge of the water, its face hidden in the darkness. I could hear the sound of my heart beating in my chest, louder now, the only thing in the world that felt real. And the voice, my voice, spoke again, louder this time. Stay. The word echoed in the space between us, reverberating through the trees and the air around me. I wanted to scream, to run, but the terror paralyzed me, my mind locked in a silent battle with the forces at work here. Was it really me? Was I speaking to myself, or was this something far more sinister? The figure moved again, its body bending unnaturally as though it were not made of flesh, but something darker, something that shifted between the shadows. And then, as if it had always been there, it spoke. You've been chosen. The voice wasn't mine anymore. It was deeper, echoing from the depths of the water, like a call from somewhere far below, from a place I could not see. I took a shaky breath, trying to summon enough strength to step back, but my legs were still unwilling, heavy, like they were sinking into the ground itself. You heard me, it continued, the voice now surrounding me, coming from all directions. You're a part of this. And you will stay. The reflection in the water began to shift, moving independently of me. Its smile grew wider, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. And then it winked. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, the world spinning around me. The river, once so familiar, now felt like a foreign, terrifying place. The trees around me whispered, their branches creaking in the wind, but the sounds, everything around me, felt distant, as if they came from far away, from a different time. A different reality. I turned to run. But I wasn't sure anymore if I was running toward escape, or if I was running deeper into something that had already claimed me. The footsteps followed me, slow and steady, as if the figure behind me knew that I couldn't escape, that I wouldn't escape. And then, I heard it again. A soft whisper, just barely audible, but unmistakable. The river spoke one last time, its voice a quiet, chilling promise. Come back. I didn't look back this time. The world felt distorted as I ran. Every step seemed heavier than the last, the ground beneath my feet uneven and treacherous. My breath was shallow, each inhalation a struggle against the overwhelming sensation that something was chasing me, pulling me back to the water, to the reflection, to that dark figure. But the forest, the once familiar trees, now seemed foreign, alien. They bent and twisted in unnatural ways, their shadows stretching and twisting like fingers, reaching out for me. The wind had picked up, rustling through the leaves with a sound that almost seemed like whispers. My name, perhaps? Or was it just the wind, playing tricks on my mind? I couldn't tell anymore. I kept running, pushing myself harder, but it felt like the space around me was closing in. The path that had once seemed clear and inviting was now unfamiliar, disorienting. Every direction seemed the same, as if I had turned in circles without realizing it. I should have reached the town by now. I should have seen the familiar roads, the houses, the lights, but all I saw were trees, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. I stopped for a moment, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breath. The silence was suffocating, but it wasn't an ordinary silence. It felt thick, oppressive, like the air itself was alive, waiting for something. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me, its shape emerging from the darkness, but there was nothing. Nothing but the endless stretch of trees and the distant sound of the river, still whispering in the background. Don't look back. The voice came again, low and steady, just like before. My own voice. I jerked around, heart racing, but no one was there. I had to get out. I had to escape. But something held me in place, something deep within, something that told me to listen, to wait. The longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. And then, the sound broke the silence. A rustling, far off, too distant to be a person, but close enough to make my skin crawl. I turned my head slowly toward the direction of the noise. There, at the edge of the trees, I saw it. A figure. A shadow. Standing perfectly still. It wasn't like the figure at the riverbank. This one was different, slightly hunched, almost as though it were waiting for something. Watching. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its gaze on me, a presence that chilled me to the core. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. Not this time. I stood frozen, my legs uncooperative, my body refusing to obey. The figure's shape seemed to distort, stretching taller and thinner, as though it were being pulled by some unseen force. I couldn't make out its face. It was hidden in the shadows, just out of reach of the dim light from the moon. But I could feel it there, watching me. Waiting. And then, in the silence, the voice came again. "Why do you run?" it asked. "You can't escape. You belong to this place now." My breath hitched to my throat. My legs felt weak, like they might give way any second. I tried to take a step back, but my feet remained glued to the ground. "You can't hide," the voice continued, soft yet persistent. "You've heard us. You've listened. And now you will stay." I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my throat felt tight, like I was choking on the very air around me. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. And then, it spoke again, its voice a strange mix of my own and something darker, something otherworldly. "Come closer." I didn't want to move. I didn't want to get any closer. But something in my chest twisted, pulling me toward it. Like a magnet, like gravity, like I had no choice but to obey. I stepped forward, just a little. And then another step. I didn't know why I was doing it, but I couldn't stop myself. The air felt heavier with every step I took, the ground beneath me softer, as though the earth itself was shifting, accommodating my movements. I was walking toward it, toward the thing that wasn't a person, toward the shape that wasn't quite human. And then it spoke again. "Let the river take you." The words echoed in my mind, growing louder, insistent. "Let the river take you." They seemed to float in the air around me, winding their way into every corner of my thoughts. My feet carried me forward despite my mind screaming at me to stop, to break free from whatever hold this place had on me. The figure in front of me didn't move, but I could feel it drawing me in, like a force I couldn't resist. The air was thick with something unnatural, an oppressive stillness that made every breath feel too heavy, too difficult. I kept walking, my steps slow, each one dragging me closer to the figure. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a desperate plea to escape, to run away, but I couldn't tear myself away. I had no control. And then, I reached it. The figure was taller now, its form fully visible in the dim light. Its face was obscured in shadow, but I could feel its gaze, cold, unblinking, as though it could see right through me, as though it could see the very thoughts swirling in my mind. It wasn't human. Not anymore. It spoke again, its voice low, but with an unnatural resonance that made my teeth ache. "You're already a part of it," it whispered, the words like a chant, a hypnotic lullaby that seeped into my soul. "The river, it calls to you. You've heard it. You've listened. Now you must join it." I couldn't speak. I wanted to, but my tongue felt heavy, like a foreign object in my mouth. Every part of me screamed to break free, but I could only stand there, staring at the figure, as its presence consumed me. I felt something shift in the air around me, like a ripple on the surface of the water, though I couldn't see anything. The sound of the river, distant at first, grew louder, more insistent, like it was calling my name, pulling me toward it. My head spun, and I felt dizzy, my vision blurring as the forest around me began to twist and warp, the trees bending at unnatural angles, their leaves rustling like whispers. Then, the figure raised its hand, its long, bony fingers stretching out toward me. "Come," it said, its voice now mingling with the sound of the river. "You belong to it. You belong to us." Something inside me snapped. The urge to run, to break free, flooded my body like a surge of adrenaline. I tore my eyes away from the figure, turning my head toward the path ahead, toward the sound of the river. It wasn't the river anymore, it was the voice of the water, pulling me in, urging me to surrender. I ran, but it wasn't a simple escape. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into the earth, like the very ground was swallowing me whole. The air grew colder, the trees closing in tighter, their branches reaching for me like hands, grasping, pulling me back. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, a chorus of sound that I could no longer separate from my own thoughts. The river was no longer just behind me, it was all around me, in the rustling of the leaves, in the creaking of the trees, in the very air I breathed. "Come back," they whispered. "You can't leave. You've already heard us." I stumbled, tripping over a root that wasn't there before, but I didn't stop. My body moved of its own accord, pushed by the overwhelming sense that if I stopped now, if I let my guard down for even a second, the water would pull me under, and I would never come back. I didn't dare look back. The path ahead was narrowing, the trees pressing in so close now that I could barely see the sky. The moonlight barely broke through the canopy, casting everything in shadow, making every movement around me seem like a threat. And then, as I ran, I saw it. The river, its dark water gleaming under the pale moonlight, stretching out before me like a vast expanse of nothingness. It was there, waiting for me, waiting to claim me. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving, the air sharp in my lungs. My mind screamed for me to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The water lapped at the shore, its surface smooth and calm, but beneath it, I could feel the presence that lurked there. The voices. "You belong to us," they said in unison, their voices like 100 whispers, blending into one. The reflection in the water stirred again, this time clear as day. It wasn't my own face staring back at me anymore, it was someone else's. Someone I didn't recognize. It smiled at me, its eyes dark and hollow. "Join us," it said, its voice a perfect mirror of my own. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. But no matter how far I moved, the river stayed the same. It was always there, always watching, always calling. And then, the ground beneath me gave way. I didn't even realize I was falling until it was too late. The ground shifted beneath my feet, giving way like soft clay under the pressure of my body, and then, nothing. I dropped into the darkness, the air around me growing cold, the sounds of the river growing louder, closer, until they consumed me entirely. The fall didn't feel real. Time seemed to stretch in strange ways, and in those brief moments as I plummeted, I thought I might have heard my name again, whispered by the voices that seemed to surround me. I reached out instinctively, hoping to catch something solid, but everything was slick, as though the earth itself had turned to water. And then I hit the surface. It wasn't the ground. No, the ground was gone, replaced by something soft, fluid, something that swallowed me whole. The water closed in around me, cool and unrelenting, pulling at me with invisible hands. I gasped, sputtering for air, but the river didn't allow me to rise. I was dragged under, the surface above me growing distant, a faint shimmer of moonlight barely reaching through the thick water. It was dark here, suffocatingly so, and as I flailed in panic, my hands brushed something smooth, cold, and alive. My heart thundered in my chest as I struggled against the pole, but the water was too strong, too deep. My lungs burned, the pressure building in my chest, but still, I couldn't stop myself from sinking. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the water, drowned by the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Suddenly, the pole stopped. I wasn't falling anymore. I was just floating, suspended in the water as if someone was holding me there. I opened my eyes, desperate to see something, anything. The water was murky, a thick blackness surrounding me, but there, I saw it. A shape. A shadow that moved through the water, slowly, deliberately, like a figure from a dream. It was coming closer, its outline growing sharper as it approached. It was the same figure. The one from the riverbank. The one I had seen in the trees. It glided through the water effortlessly, its body shifting, bending in unnatural ways. Its eyes, those eyes, glowed faintly, dark and endless, as if they were absorbing the very light around them. The figure's lips curled into a grin, an expression I knew all too well, but now it felt different. It felt wrong. It leaned closer, and the whispering began again. But this time, the voices were clearer, louder, as if they were coming from the figure itself. "You can't leave now," it said, its voice both soft and commanding, like a deep, distant echo. "You're already here, with us. You belong here." My body jerked as though reacting to the words, a tremor running through me. I felt the cold pressure of the water tightening around my chest, squeezing the life out of me. "Let me go!" I gasped, the words barely escaping my lips as I struggled against the water that seemed to hold me in place. But the figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. The water began to shift, swirling around me in a slow, deliberate motion, like it was alive. It tugged at me, drawing me deeper into the darkness beneath the surface. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The voices, those damn voices, grew louder, overlapping in a tangled web of whispers, calling my name, beckoning me deeper. "Come closer," the figure said again, its voice merging with the chorus of whispers. "Let the river take you. You are ours now." I felt it, the final surrender, the point where I could no longer fight. I had already given in, already listened. The river was a part of me now, and I was a part of it. There was no escape. And then, in the suffocating darkness, the world tilted. It wasn't like being submerged in water anymore. It was like being pulled into something else. A different space. A different reality. I felt weightless, suspended in a place where time didn't exist, where the world had no edges. I saw something, them figures, shapes moving in the murk, indistinct, shifting in and out of focus, watching, waiting. And then I realized the truth. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. The river was not just a body of water. It was a place, a realm, a prison, and I was now part of it. I was one of them. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the voice, soft and soothing, yet terrifying in its certainty. Welcome home. I woke in darkness. It wasn't the kind of darkness I had known before. This wasn't the comforting blackness of closed eyes, the kind that comes when you sleep too long or when night falls too quickly. No, this darkness felt alive, pressing in from all sides, heavy, suffocating. It wrapped around me like a cold, wet blanket, pulling at my limbs, my chest, my very soul. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, or who I was. The memories of the forest, the river, the figure, they were distant, like dreams fading in the early morning light. And yet, beneath that haze, there was something. A feeling. An instinct, a flicker of recognition that told me I needed to move, that I wasn't supposed to be here. I tried to open my eyes, but there was no light. No distinction between open and closed. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the thick, oppressive silence that surrounded me. I was trapped. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't floating anymore. I wasn't suspended in the water, nor was I lying on the solid earth. It was like I was entombed, buried beneath layers of something cold and ancient, something that had swallowed me whole. I had been pulled under. The water had claimed me. But I had never imagined this. Slowly, my hand reached out, blindly grasping at the nothingness. There was a texture to it, smooth and slick, like wet stone, but it moved beneath my fingers, squirming in strange, unpredictable ways. It felt like a living thing, an organism that breathed beneath my touch. The air I breathed was thick with the scent of decay, stagnant water, and something else, something sharp, metallic, like rust. And then movement. Not around me. No, this was inside me. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, more insistent now, beating so hard it felt like it might break free. My body shook with the need to escape, to rip myself free from whatever had me. But there was nowhere to go. I opened my mouth to breathe, but the air was dense, cloying, a suffocating presence pressing against my lungs, refusing to allow anything other than the hollow, silent weight of this place. I felt eyes. Somewhere in the abyss, unseen, there was a presence. I could feel it, like a pressure on my skin, a gaze that had found me, that had always been watching. I couldn't see it, couldn't understand it, but I knew it was there. And it was waiting for me to realize what had happened, what this place was. The river wasn't just a river. This wasn't just a prison. This was something ancient. Something alive. The very earth beneath me, the water that had dragged me down, everything that surrounded me, it was part of it. The voices, the whispers, the endless call, they were not the river's voice. They were the voices of those who had come before me, who had been taken and had become one with the river's endless, dark current. They were the river, and I was becoming part of it too. You have joined us. The voice came from somewhere within me, a whisper in my mind, the words curling like smoke in the silence. I wanted to scream again, to fight back, to push against the pull that threatened to swallow me whole. But it was no use. The more I resisted, the tighter the grip became. The water, the shadow, the presence, it was everywhere, inescapable, entwined with me. It wasn't the outside world anymore. It was within me, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into its fold. The whispers grew louder, then softer, then louder again. Each voice was familiar now, mingling with my own thoughts, until I couldn't tell where I ended and they began. They filled my mind, my very essence, until I was no longer sure what was real or imagined. "Welcome home," they whispered in unison. And then I saw it. A faint flicker of light in the distance, so small, so far away, but there. A tiny spark that broke through the crushing darkness, casting strange, flickering shadows on the walls of my prison. It wasn't real, I told myself. It couldn't be. But the pull was too strong. I began to move toward it. Not with my own will, but with something deeper, something that had taken root in me. My body moved as if it knew the way, as though it had always known. I reached for the light, my arms outstretched, but it flickered, wavering like a candle caught in the wind. It was the river. It was always the river. And as my fingers brushed against the light, I understood. I was no longer human. Not in the way I had once been. I was part of something far greater, far darker. Something that existed beneath the surface, in the space between life and death, in the places where time no longer held meaning. I was one of the voices now. The light flickered once more, but this time it didn't fade. It grew, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it grew, pulling me in, drawing me toward it. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a sense of clarity pierced through the suffocating darkness around me. I was moving now, but not on my own. My limbs moved as if they were not my own, controlled by something else, something ancient. I was still submerged, still bound to the cold, wet earth that had become my prison. But the pull of the light was undeniable. I reached out again, the water swirling around me like 1,000 hands, tugging at my skin, urging me back into the depths. "No," I whispered to myself, though my voice sounded hollow, distant, as though someone else were speaking. "I need to leave. I need to go." But the words didn't come from my mouth. They echoed from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside the darkness. The voices. The voices had been here long before me, and they were going to be here long after I was gone. The light grew stronger, now a burning beacon in the distance. A sliver of moonlight, pale and unyielding, cast its glow on the endless void around me, illuminating shapes that were no longer just shadows. Figures, faint and indistinct, swirled in the water, moving around me like dancers, their movements strange and slow, as though they were bound by invisible chains. The figures were familiar. They looked like me, like people who had been trapped here before. My heart pounded in my chest, faster now, the rhythm steady and insistent. I was close, too close to something I couldn't quite understand. The light beckoned me, like the reflection of my own desires, my own escape. But something else stirred beneath me. I felt it before I saw it. A weight, heavier than anything I had felt before, pressing against my chest, against my soul. I tried to move, to swim, to break free from it, but it was no use. I was sinking once more, dragged deeper into the water's depths. "Let go," came the voice again, soft and patient, but insistent. You can't fight it. It's where you belong. It's where we all belong. The water enveloped me, swallowing me whole, until there was no more light, no more air. I was submerged in an abyss so deep it felt as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled around me, leaving me in a world where only the river existed. The river was alive. I understood that now. It was a consciousness, a force that had no beginning and no end. It was the beginning and the end, all at once. And I was part of it. My body, my thoughts, my existence, they had become one with the flow of its waters. I had fought, I had struggled, I had clung to what was once my reality. But in the end, it was inevitable. The river claimed me. I felt my body change. My heart, which had once beaten with fear, with dread, with life, grew still. My thoughts, once so sharp, so desperate, grew quiet. I was no longer afraid. There was no fear here, no confusion, no struggle. Only acceptance. And then, as if a veil had been lifted from my mind, I understood. I was not just part of the river now. I was its voice. I was the river's whisper in the night. I was the sound of the water crashing against the shore. I was the echo of those who had come before me, and I would be the whisper of those who came after. I was endless. I opened my mouth, and the sound that emerged wasn't my own. It was the sound of the river, the eternal, unceasing flow of the water. It whispered my name, but it was no longer my name. It was a name that belonged to the river, a name that belonged to all who had come before. You belong to us. The words echoed in my mind, and I knew they would never stop. The river would always speak. It would always call. It would always be. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer just hearing the voices. I was them. Have you ever felt like something was watching you? Not in the way you imagine, but the kind of feeling that starts with an ordinary noise, a flicker in the corner of your eye, or a shift in the air, and then it stays. It lingers, growing in your mind until you can't escape it. I never thought I would be one of those people who get scared by strange noises, but something was different about this place. I wasn't used to it at first. I had moved into the apartment just a few weeks ago. It was small, cozy, and the rent was reasonable, which was all that mattered after a long search for somewhere affordable in the city. But there was something about that wardrobe. I didn't even think about it when I first moved in. It was just a simple, old wooden wardrobe, standing silently in the corner of the bedroom. At first, I thought it added character to the room. Maybe it was the kind of piece you find in a thrift shop, worn with time but still sturdy. There was nothing odd about it. It had no drawers or compartments, just a single pair of wooden doors that, when opened, revealed a dark, empty space inside. It wasn't until the first night that things started to change. I woke up in the middle of the night. The room was dark and quiet, save for the faint sound of the city outside. At first, I thought it was just the noise of the wind or maybe the sound of my own breathing. But then, I noticed something. The wardrobe doors, they were slightly open. Maybe an inch or two. I was sure they had been closed when I went to bed. I turned over in bed, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. The wind, maybe. Or I had just forgotten to close them properly. But then, I noticed something else. On the floor in front of the wardrobe, there was a thin layer of dust. It wasn't there when I had cleaned earlier in the day. I knew it for sure. The floor had been spotless. I lay there in the dark, staring at the sliver of open space between the doors, and for some reason, I couldn't look away. The dust on the floor, it was so fine, so evenly spread, like something had been dragged through it, leaving no trace of its movement except for the impression of its presence. And the feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. I told myself it was nothing. I forced my eyes shut and tried to sleep again, but I couldn't. The feeling wouldn't leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like the shadows were moving closer, like they were stretching out from the wardrobe to reach me. When I woke up in the morning, the wardrobe doors were shut again, and the dust on the floor was gone. It was as if nothing had happened. But that unsettling feeling? It stayed. As the days passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Every night, I'd hear the slight creak of the wardrobe doors, just a little more than before. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see them slightly ajar, and other times, I'd wake up and feel the air in the room had changed, heavy with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just the wardrobe anymore. I began to notice other things, the way the air felt cooler around the wardrobe, how the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch longer than the others, or how sometimes, just before I went to bed, I'd hear a sound. A rustle. Like something shifting, moving. One night, after hearing the creak of the wardrobe doors again, I decided to check. I couldn't stand it any longer. My mind was racing, asking questions I couldn't answer. Why did the wardrobe always open a little more? Why was the dust never there in the morning? I got out of bed, my feet cold against the floor, and walked over to the wardrobe. The air around it felt unnaturally cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a deep breath and pulled the doors open. Nothing. The space inside was empty. I checked the bottom, the sides, the top. There was nothing unusual, no hidden compartments, no loose boards. Just an ordinary wooden wardrobe. But the dust, there was still something about it. The edges of the floor around the wardrobe were covered in a thin, almost imperceptible layer of it, as if someone or something had moved across the room during the night. And as I stood there, staring at the empty wardrobe, I felt something else. A chill. It came from inside the wardrobe. It wasn't the cold air of the apartment. No, it was something else. The air seemed to shift, to contract, as if the space within the wardrobe were stretching, expanding in a way that wasn't possible. I backed away slowly, but then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like the scrape of something light against the floor. It was coming from inside the wardrobe. The doors slammed shut by themselves, as if some invisible force had pushed them together. My heart raced, and I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in the room. The sound of movement continued, now a little louder, like something or someone was inside, just beyond the reach of my eyes. And then, just like that, it stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. But there was nothing now. The room was silent, the air still. The wardrobe was closed, and the dust was gone again. I don't know what's happening, but I know this, there's something in that wardrobe. And every night, it's waiting for me. The next morning, I didn't want to leave my bed. I couldn't bring myself to face the wardrobe, couldn't bear the thought of it being there, just waiting. I had to get out. I had to escape. I thought of Anna, who was supposed to come over, and the terror that had gripped me. How could I explain any of this to her? Would she think I was losing my mind? I tried to get up, but my body felt heavy, like I was glued to the sheets. My mind was telling me I needed to leave, but fear held me in place. The night had been too much. What had I seen? What had I felt? That shadow, was it real, or was it my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark? I had no answers. Only questions that twisted inside my head, growing darker by the second. There was a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I froze. I didn't want to answer it. I wasn't ready to face anyone, least of all Anna, but I had to. I stumbled to the door, my hand shaking, and opened it. Anna stood there, looking concerned, a bag of coffee and snacks in her hand. She was always so calm, so sure of herself. I envied her ability to stay grounded. "You okay?" she asked softly, her eyes scanning me, taking in the disheveled state I was in. I didn't know how to respond. The fear, the unease, everything felt too much. But I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired." She didn't buy it, but she didn't press me. "I brought coffee. Let's sit down and talk." We went to the kitchen, and I made us both coffee. As we sat, I tried to explain, but the words didn't come out right. How could I explain the unexplainable? The shadow, the movement, the feeling of something watching me? It all sounded insane. "Anna, you have to believe me," I said, my voice shaky. "There's something in the wardrobe. It's not just an old piece of furniture. Something's inside it. I don't know what it is, but I'm not imagining it." Anna listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she took a deep breath. "I'm not going to lie to you. This sounds crazy, but I'll stay with you tonight. We'll figure it out together." I wanted to feel comforted by her words, but all I could feel was dread. The idea of spending another night in that apartment with that thing in the wardrobe. I didn't know how much longer I could handle it. That evening, as the sun began to set, the apartment grew darker. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the atmosphere itself was closing in on me. I kept my eyes fixed on the wardrobe, but I didn't dare get too close. Anna had offered to check the wardrobe, but I begged her not to. The thought of someone opening it, even for a second, made my skin crawl. We sat on the couch, both of us tense, waiting. I tried to act normal, to distract myself, but I couldn't stop looking at the wardrobe. The silence in the room was unbearable. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, made my heart race. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper, coming from the direction of the wardrobe. It was a rustling, a shuffling, as though something was moving inside. But I couldn't see anything. There was no movement. I turned to Anna, my eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Anna nodded, her face pale. "I heard it." We both sat still, waiting. The noise stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet again. Then, the door creaked open. Not a lot, but enough for me to see the darkness inside. My breath caught in my throat. I could hear something breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from within. The air in the room grew colder, and I saw Anna's hand tremble as she reached for mine. She didn't say anything, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She had never been one to get scared easily, but whatever was in that wardrobe was beyond her understanding. The shadow moved again, and I swear, for a second, I saw it, a long, thin arm creeping out of the wardrobe. It wasn't human. The fingers were too long, too thin, and the skin, if it was skin, was as pale as bone. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The shadow disappeared back inside, and the door slammed shut with a force that shook the apartment. I screamed. It wasn't a sound I recognized. I had never been a person to scream, but I couldn't stop it. The terror flooded through me, choking me, suffocating me. Anna jumped to her feet, her face ashen. We need to leave. Now. I didn't argue. We grabbed our things in a frenzy, moving quickly, almost as though the apartment itself were trying to stop us. I didn't look back as we ran out the door, but I could feel it. That presence, watching us, waiting. I knew it wasn't over. We didn't go far. We stayed at a nearby cafe until late into the night, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, lingering in the back of my mind. That wardrobe was still there, waiting for me to return. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The image of that arm, pale and impossibly thin, haunted my thoughts. It lingered like a shadow in the corners of my mind every time I closed my eyes. I could almost feel it, cold and unnatural, brushing against my skin. Anna tried to calm me down, but I couldn't escape the fear that gripped me. We had left the apartment, but I knew deep down that it wasn't enough. The wardrobe, whatever was inside it, was still there. It was still waiting. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the apartment building. The sun was shining, but the air felt heavy. Anna was with me, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She didn't want to go back in either. But we had no choice. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't just keep running. The fear of it, the unknown, it was driving me mad. I needed answers, even if they were terrifying. We climbed the stairs to my apartment in silence, each step feeling heavier than the last. When we reached the door, I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. The apartment was silent. Too silent. I opened the door. The place seemed unchanged, but I could feel it, that thick, oppressive air. It was like the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I turned to Anna, my voice barely a whisper. I have to open it. She didn't say anything, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't want me to, but she understood. We had no answers. No way out, not without confronting it. I walked slowly toward the wardrobe. Every step felt like an eternity. The room around me seemed to distort, the walls pressing in on me, the silence growing louder. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, thudding in time with the rhythm of my breath. And then, the door. The wardrobe door. It was slightly open. Not much, just enough to let me see a sliver of darkness inside. I couldn't help it. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I gripped the handle. For a moment, I stood there, staring at it. Waiting. What was inside? What had been inside all along? I pulled the door open. The smell hit me first, old, musty, like something had been trapped inside for years. But it wasn't just the smell. There was a coldness, a chill that rushed out of the wardrobe, filling the room. It felt wrong, unnatural. The air seemed to freeze around me, and my breath caught in my throat. I looked inside, my heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there. Just dust. Just the layers of old, forgotten time. No shadows. No arm. Nothing. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me, but only for a moment. There was something off about the way the dust settled on the floor. It wasn't like before when it was neatly undisturbed. It had been disturbed. There were footprints in the dust. Tiny, shallow impressions, almost as if someone had been inside the wardrobe, moving around. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the chair beside me. My hands were shaking, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My mind raced. What did this mean? Had I imagined everything before? The arm, the shadow, was it all just in my head? But then I saw it. At the very back of the wardrobe, behind the clothes hanging there, was something I hadn't noticed before. A small door. It was hidden, almost blending into the wood of the wardrobe, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. I couldn't believe I had missed it. My hands felt clammy as I reached for it. The door was cold to the touch, but was smooth and ancient. I could feel my heart pounding and my breath quickening. What was behind it? What was I about to uncover? I opened it. At first, there was nothing. Just a small, empty space behind the wardrobe, dark and still. But then, something shifted. A shadow, a movement too fast for me to comprehend. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back, bumping into Anna. "What the hell is that?" she gasped, her voice trembling. I looked again, my eyes wide. There, at the back of the hidden compartment, was a box. It wasn't big, but it looked old, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. The air around it seemed wrong, like the very space around the box was alive, breathing. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to know what it contained, but the pull was undeniable. Something inside me urged me forward, urged me to open it. I couldn't stop myself. I reached into the darkness, my fingers brushing against the cool surface of the box. It was heavier than I expected. As I pulled it out, the room seemed to tilt. The air grew colder, thicker. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Leave." It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, like it was coming from the walls themselves. The sound was suffocating, filling the room, and I froze. The box slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a thud. Anna screamed. I looked at the box again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just an ordinary box anymore. There were symbols carved into its surface, symbols that seemed to shift and move in the dim light. The room grew darker around us, and the temperature dropped even further. I knew, in that moment, we had opened something we weren't meant to. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for us. And whatever it wasn't finished with us yet. The room had grown impossibly cold, the temperature dropping so quickly it felt as if the very air around us was freezing. I could see my breath in the dim light, clouding in front of my face, each exhale a small puff of light that seemed to dissolve into the darkness. The box lay on the floor, silent, but I could feel it pulsing with some sort of energy. It was as if the room itself was aware of it, aware of us. Anna stood a few feet away, her eyes wide with panic, her breath quick and shallow. "What is that thing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could do was stare at the box, my mind racing, my body frozen in place. There was something wrong about it, something inherently wrong. It felt like it wasn't supposed to be here, like it had been buried for a reason, and now we had dug it up. The symbols on the surface of the box shifted again, twisting and curling in ways that made my stomach churn. I could almost hear them, their movement like a soft, distant hum that reverberated in my skull. I felt a pull deep within me, urging me closer. The box was calling to me. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to touch it, but my hands were already reaching down, my fingers stretching toward it before I even realized what I was doing. "No!" Anna cried, grabbing my arm, but I could barely feel her touch. It was as if I had become disconnected from everything around me. With one swift motion, I picked up the box. The air seemed to choke me, tightening around my throat. The darkness in the room deepened, as if it was closing in on us, suffocating us. The walls felt like they were pressing in, the ceiling lowering, and I could hear it, the voice. Louder now, closer, clearer. "Leave now, or it will be too late." I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't understand why I was holding the box or what was in it. My mind screamed at me to put it down, to leave, to run as far away as I could, but I couldn't. I opened it. The lid creaked, slow and deliberate, as if the box had been waiting for this moment for a long time. I flinched as it opened, my heart pounding, my breath catching in my throat. Inside the box, there was nothing. Or so it seemed at first. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it, something small, something dark, like a shadow within a shadow. It was a tiny figure, barely visible, its form shifting as if it were made of smoke. I couldn't look away, couldn't tear my eyes from it. It didn't have a face. It had no features at all, just an empty void where its face should have been, and yet I could feel it staring at me. I couldn't breathe. "Get rid of it!" Anna shouted, her voice a mixture of fear and desperation. She tried to pull me back, but I couldn't move. My body felt as if it were rooted to the spot, trapped in some invisible force. The tiny figure in the box started to grow. It expanded, filling the space around us, stretching its limbs as though they were made of the very darkness itself. I felt it, the pressure, the force pressing in from all sides. It was in the air. It was in the room. The figure moved, but not in the way anything should move. It was like watching a shadow stretch, a black liquid seeping into the corners of the room, curling around everything. It had no shape, no distinct form, just darkness that seemed to reach for me, to drag me into it. I dropped the box. It hit the floor with a dull thud, but the shadow kept coming, spilling out of the box, wrapping around the room like a fog, suffocating everything in its path. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat felt tight, constricted. "Run!" Anna screamed. "We have to get out of here." But I couldn't. I couldn't move. The shadow was everywhere now, filling the apartment, consuming everything. My vision blurred, and I felt a pressure against my chest, as if something was crushing me from the inside out. And then, through the darkness, I saw something. A figure. A shadow. It was tall, towering, and its face, if you could even call it a face, was a black void, an empty space where eyes should have been. I couldn't look away, couldn't tear my gaze from it. "Leave." It whispered again, but this time its voice was different. It was not just in my head. It was in the room, surrounding us. I felt it in my bones, deep inside me, cold and unrelenting. I understood. The voice wasn't just telling us to leave. It was telling us that we had no choice. I couldn't run. I couldn't breathe. The shadow was closing in, and I knew that it was too late. The darkness had already consumed everything. With one final push, the shadow reached out, enveloping me, and in that moment, I understood that it was not just the apartment that was lost. It was me. I had opened something that could not be closed again. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Anna, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror as the darkness consumed her too. And then, nothing. Have you ever looked around and wondered if you were truly alone? It's a question we don't usually ask, but what if the answer is something more unsettling? What if, despite all appearances, you're never as alone as you think? It was late in the evening when I first noticed it. I had been living in the same house for years, the kind of place that feels like a safe haven, the walls familiar and comforting. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. I had come to love the silence, the stillness that surrounded me, but that night, it was different. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner and was about to settle down with a book when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the window, but it didn't feel like wind. It was a sharp crack, like glass breaking. I froze. The sound was too clear, too precise. My heart started racing. I pushed open the living room door and stepped into the hallway. I immediately noticed it. The window in the front room was shattered, the glass scattered across the floor like jagged pieces of ice. There was no sign of forced entry. No footprints. No broken locks. Just the glass, glinting under the soft light of the hallway lamp. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. How could this have happened? I hadn't heard anything earlier, no warning. I went to the window, checking the latch, but it was still secure. I looked outside, but there was no one. The street was as empty as it always was at that hour. I turned back to the room and saw something else on the floor, something that shouldn't have been there, a photograph. A single photo, slightly crumpled, with an image of me, my face, clear as day, staring back at me. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a recent picture. It was old, a photo taken years ago, before I moved in. But there it was, lying on the floor, as if someone had carefully placed it there. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I picked it up. I flipped it over, hoping to find some clue, some explanation, but there was nothing. No name. No date. Just my face, staring back at me, frozen in time. I didn't know what to make of it. My mind raced. Could it be a prank? But who would go through the trouble of breaking a window and leaving an old photograph behind? And why was it of me? I glanced around the room again, the unease growing. The silence of the house had become oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching me. The shadows seemed deeper now, more menacing. I could hear my own breath, ragged in the stillness. That's when I noticed something else. The air felt wrong. It was heavier somehow, thicker, like the space around me had changed. The house no longer felt like a safe refuge. It felt watched. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder now, every shadow seemed to shift with purpose. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I put the photograph down on the table, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The glass on the floor was sharp, each step I took felt more dangerous, more deliberate. But I couldn't leave it like this. I needed to figure out what had happened, why this was happening. As I moved to grab the broom to sweep up the glass, I heard it again, the sound of a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor. I stopped. It was coming from upstairs. My heart pounded as I stared up the staircase, the dim light from below casting long shadows over the steps. No one should be up there. I was the only one in the house. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I set the broom down, and for the first time that night, I felt the cold grip of fear tighten around my chest. Someone, or something, was in my house. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. This couldn't be happening. Not in my own home. But I knew, deep down, that the night was far from over. The broken glass was only the beginning. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, the faint rustling sound still echoing from above. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house settling. Someone, or something, was moving around up there. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, just out of sight. My instinct screamed at me to run, to flee from the house and never look back. But I couldn't. I didn't know who or what was upstairs, but I wasn't about to leave without answers. I forced myself to move, each step heavier than the last, as if the house itself was trying to hold me back. The stairway creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, the sound loud in the silence of the house. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I reached the top of the stairs and glanced down the hallway. The door to the guest bedroom was ajar, a sliver of darkness peering through the gap. The footsteps had stopped. The house was silent again. I crept toward the door, my breath shallow. The air around me felt thick, as if the atmosphere itself had grown dense with something I couldn't name. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges protesting with a low groan. The room was empty, save for the shadows that clung to the corners like darkened memories. The bed was undisturbed, the curtains drawn tight against the window. But there, in the middle of the floor, was something else. A second photograph. I gasped. There it was, another image of me. But this time, it was taken more recently, maybe just a few months ago. I didn't recognize the setting, it wasn't a place I had been. My face looked different. The photo was blurred, as though it had been taken from a distance, the edges of my image fading into something that felt unnatural. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I picked it up. The back was blank, just like the first. My thoughts were a mess. Who was doing this? How did they get these photos? And why was I being targeted like this? Suddenly, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, but this time they were coming from behind me. I whipped around, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. But the footsteps had been unmistakable, slow, deliberate, like someone was stalking me, following my every move. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed to get out of this house, but the thought of leaving made me feel like I was giving into something unseen, something that would only grow stronger the longer I stayed away. But staying didn't feel much safer either. The silence was oppressive now. I couldn't even hear my own breath. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, growing longer and darker. The house felt alive in a way it never had before, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned and ran down the stairs, the echo of my footsteps louder than ever. I had to get out. I grabbed my phone from the table, but as I unlocked it, I froze. There was a new message on the screen. No subject. Just one line of text: "You shouldn't have gone upstairs." I dropped the phone, a chill running through my body. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath in the air. It was like the temperature had dropped by several degrees in the span of just a few moments. The shadows around me seemed to thicken, to curl in on themselves. I turned toward the front door. It was the only way out, the only way to escape whatever was happening here. But as I reached for the handle, the door started to close. On its own. Slowly at first, but then faster, as if something or someone was pushing it shut. My hand shot out, desperately grabbing the handle. I yanked with all my strength, but the door wouldn't budge. That's when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. But this time, they were right behind me. I could feel the weight of the footsteps behind me, so close now that it sent a ripple of cold terror down my spine. The air was thick with a presence, something that was not just in the house, but of the house itself, as though the walls had grown alive, breathing with a sinister, hidden intention. My fingers were locked around the door handle, my entire body tense with the force of trying to open it. It didn't move. Not an inch. I pulled again, harder this time, but the door was resisting, as though it were being held shut by an invisible hand. The footsteps grew louder, each step deliberate, methodical. And then, there was a soft whisper. It was so faint that I thought I had imagined it at first, but then it came again, closer this time. Turn around. I froze. The voice was low, chilling, and so quiet it sounded almost like it was inside my head. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly turned, knowing deep down that I shouldn't. But I had to see what was there. I had to know if I was truly alone, or if the thing hunting me had already made its move. I faced the hallway, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. But I saw nothing. The silence in the house had become deafening again, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Then, a shape moved in the corner of my vision. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was like a shadow, but more solid, more real. It twisted, shifting unnaturally, its edges blurred and undefined, as though it didn't belong in the space around it. It was moving toward me, slowly but unmistakably. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My mind was locked in terror, my body refusing to react. The shadow grew larger, more defined, until it took on a shape I couldn't ignore. It looked like a person, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like it didn't understand the way a human form should be. The presence spoke again, the voice a guttural rasp, as if the words had been dragged up from the depths of something ancient and dark. You shouldn't have seen me. The words cut through the air like ice, and I felt my chest tighten, the space around me closing in. I reached for the door handle again, my fingers numb with fear. The thing in front of me took another step, its movements fluid but disturbing, like it was gliding just above the floor. It was so close now that I could feel the chill in the air around it. The temperature dropped further, and I saw my breath cloud in front of me, thick and white. Leave, it whispered, but it wasn't a command. It was a threat. The way it spoke made it clear that the house, the space around us, belonged to it. I was the intruder here. The door. I had to get the door open. I yanked at the handle again, desperate, but it remained firmly shut. My panic surged. What was this thing? Why was it here? Why was it targeting me? Suddenly, the shadow moved toward me, and I instinctively took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The air felt thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe properly. The house seemed to close in around me, as though it were trapping me inside with this thing. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud it was the only thing I could hear. The shadow reached out with long, clawed fingers, the tips grazing my skin. It was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt. And in that touch, I felt something else, a pressure, a weight, like my very soul was being pulled toward it. The feeling was overwhelming, like I was being sucked into a vortex, everything around me spinning and fading. I tried to pull away, but the fingers held me fast, tightening with an unyielding grip. "You will stay," the thing said, its voice sharp and final. With all the strength I could muster, I tore myself free, stumbling backward. I felt the weight of its gaze on me, its presence pressing in on all sides. The shadow began to flicker, its shape warping as if it was no longer tethered to reality. The room grew darker still, the walls narrowing, the air growing colder. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to break free. The door had to open. I lunged at the door handle once more, and this time I heard a sound, a click. The door creaked open. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I bolted through the door and into the night air, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I ran down the stairs, I felt a whisper brush against my ear. "You can't escape me." I stopped dead in my tracks, the words reverberating in my mind, a bone-chilling truth that I couldn't deny. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the shadow. It was me. It had always been me. The photographs, the glass, the presence. It was all connected. And now I was part of it. I stumbled into the cold night, the chill of the air biting at my skin, but it did nothing to numb the terror that gripped my mind. My breath was ragged, my heart still thundering in my chest as I looked back at the house. The windows were dark, the doors shut tight. The place looked normal, but I knew better now. I knew that something had followed me, something that had been waiting in the shadows, patiently, for far longer than I realized. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that I was safe. But the whispering voice still echoed in my mind, like it was inside my skull, crawling under my skin. "You can't escape me." The words didn't leave me. They stuck with me like a thick, heavy fog, choking out any thoughts of peace or safety. There was no escaping it. The shadow. The presence. It was real, and it was mine. My own reflection, my own fear manifested. I forced myself to look away from the house and ran. The street was empty, the neighborhood silent as ever. But every shadow seemed to watch me, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, as though I could outrun whatever was coming for me. I reached my car and fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if there was anywhere I could go that would be far enough. The thing in the house, it wasn't just in the house. It was inside me now, crawling through my mind, taking root in my thoughts. I slammed the car door shut and started the engine, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly I thought I might snap it in half. I drove, aimlessly at first, my mind swirling with a mix of fear, confusion, and dread. But no matter how far I went, no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The road stretched out before me, dark and empty, but the darkness seemed to move with me, keeping pace. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The reflection of the empty road stared back at me, but for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. A shadow. It was small at first, just a flicker at the edge of my vision, but it grew. It stretched, moving closer. I blinked and looked again. Nothing. But I could feel it. That cold, suffocating presence creeping in behind me, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. I sped up, pushing the car harder, but the shadow was there, always just behind me. It was inescapable. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It was not just the house. It wasn't just the photographs. It was me. I had brought it with me. The shadow was not something outside of me. It was an extension of myself, a reflection of something deep inside, something that had been waiting to surface. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I parked the car. My mind was spinning. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't make sense of anything. But then, as I sat there in the silence, a cold chill swept over me. I turned to look out the window. And there, standing just beyond the edge of the headlights, was the figure. It wasn't the shadow anymore. It was solid, real, and unmistakably human. It was me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stood there, staring at me with empty eyes, its face a twisted version of my own, distorted by some dark, incomprehensible force. It reached a hand out toward me, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. "You can't escape," it whispered, the words soft, yet so close I could feel them in my bones. I slammed the car into gear and drove off, my heart racing faster than the engine could keep up with. But I could feel it behind me, always behind me, just out of reach, yet always there, pulling me towards something I couldn't understand. The road blurred around me, the world outside becoming a distorted mess of colors and lights. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. But no matter how far I went, no matter how fast I ran, the presence followed. I was trapped. And no matter how much I tried to escape, I couldn't outrun the truth. It wasn't the house that was haunted. It was me. And there was no escaping it. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. But no matter how many miles I put between myself and the house, the feeling never left. The presence, that cold, suffocating thing, was always there. Watching. Waiting. Following. I drove aimlessly, through darkened streets and empty roads, not knowing where I was or where I was going. I didn't stop for gas, didn't stop for food. The thought of going back to my house, or anywhere familiar, was unbearable. It was as if the house had become a part of me, a shadow that I couldn't escape no matter how far I ran. At some point, the roads became unfamiliar. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore, but it didn't matter. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that twisted reflection again, that distorted version of myself, standing just behind me. But every time I looked, the mirror was empty. The road behind me was empty. There was nothing there, except for the weight in my chest that told me otherwise. Eventually, I pulled off the highway into an old, run-down motel. The lights were dim, flickering on and off, and the place smelled like damp wood and stale air. But I didn't care. I needed to sleep. I needed to escape the constant weight of fear, even if only for a moment. I walked into the small, dimly lit office and rented a room. The clerk didn't even look up as I handed over cash. He simply tossed me the key, and I took it, my hand shaking. The room was sparse, just a bed, a small desk, a cracked mirror on the wall. The faint hum of an old air conditioner buzzed in the corner, but otherwise, it was quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind still racing. My hands were clammy, my pulse quick and erratic. I tried to calm myself, tried to take slow, deep breaths, but the weight of what I had seen, of what I had felt, was suffocating. I glanced at the mirror. The reflection was blurry, distorted by the dim light. But as I stared at it, I felt something stir. A shadow shifted within the glass, just out of my direct line of sight. I flinched, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the twisted shadow or the figure outside the car. It was something else. It was me. But not. My reflection didn't quite match up with my movements. My face, my eyes, looked wrong, hollow, empty. Like it was a version of me that had been twisted by something beyond understanding. I stood up quickly, stumbling back from the mirror. But my reflection remained unmoving, staring back at me with a chilling emptiness. "You can't run from yourself," the voice said, not from behind me this time, but from within the glass. I gasped, the words like a cold fist around my chest. I didn't know how, but I felt the presence in the room now, behind me, closer than ever. I turned, half expecting to see the figure standing there. But the room was empty. The air was thick, though heavy and oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, the echo of the voice still ringing in my mind. "You can't outrun it." I felt something stir within me, a dark realization that I had been running not just from the house or the shadow, but from something much deeper. Something that I had ignored for too long. The reflection in the mirror, the cold presence, it wasn't just some supernatural force. It wasn't an external thing trying to invade my home. It was something inside me, something that had always been there, lurking in the shadows of my own mind, waiting to be seen. I stumbled back, feeling the weight of the truth settle over me like a crushing weight. The house, the photographs, the shadow, it had all been a warning. A warning that I couldn't escape who I was, no matter how far I ran. I was the one who had called it into existence. I had created it by hiding from my own fears, my own darkness. It wasn't just haunting me, it was me. The mirror flickered, and for a moment, I saw the twisted figure of myself in the reflection, its eyes wide, its face contorted in a silent scream. I reached out, but the glass seemed to ripple like water, as if the reflection was no longer bound by the rules of reality. The darkness in the room thickened, suffocating me. I could hear my own breath in my ears, the voice of the shadow growing louder. "You will never be free." The room began to spin, the walls closing in on me, the shadow creeping forward. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The mirror seemed to stretch, pulling me toward it. The reflection in the glass smiled. And I realized, in that moment, there was no escape. Not from the house. Not from the shadow. And not from myself. The darkness swallowed me whole, and the last thing I heard was my own voice echoing in the silence. "You can't escape." And then, nothing. Have you ever seen something that made you question everything you thought you knew? Something so small, yet so unsettling, that it stuck with you long after the moment had passed? It was a typical winter afternoon when I first noticed the tracks. The kind of quiet, snowy day that made everything feel still, like the world had slowed down. I was walking through a field near my house, the snow crunching beneath my boots, my breath puffing in the cold air. The sky above was a dull gray, clouds heavy and low, but the snow, fresh and untouched, gave the world a soft, clean look. It was peaceful, at least at first. But then, I saw them. At first, they seemed harmless enough, just a pair of footprints in the snow, leading out from the edge of the field, right into the middle. There was nothing strange about them, at least not initially. The tracks were clear, almost pristine, each step deep in the snow, leaving a perfect impression in the white blanket. But as I walked closer, something about them began to feel wrong. The tracks began in the usual way, like someone had walked across the field. They seemed normal: shoes, boots. I couldn't tell which, each one spaced evenly apart, as if whoever had made them was just taking a stroll, enjoying the winter air. But when I reached the middle of the field, I stopped dead. The footprints didn't end. They just stopped. Right there, in the middle of the open space. There was no sign of anyone turning around or walking off in a different direction. Just a pair of footprints that started in the snow and then nothing. I took a step closer, my breath catching in my throat. The silence of the snow-covered world around me was deafening. And then, the tracks started to change. It was subtle at first. The footprints, once just average-sized impressions in the snow, began to grow larger. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a slight widening of the space between each step, a tiny difference in depth. But it didn't take long for the change to become obvious. The footprints were getting bigger. The impressions in the snow were now so deep, I could almost hear the snow shifting under their weight. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. It didn't make sense. If someone had made these tracks, why would they just stop in the middle of the field? And why were the footprints getting larger? Was it possible someone had come out here, made the tracks, and then changed somehow? I knelt down, my hand trembling as I reached toward the snow. I traced the edge of one of the footprints with my fingers. It was deeper than the others, much deeper. I stood up again, scanning the area. There were no other tracks. No sign of anything nearby. It was as if whatever had made these footprints had simply appeared and then disappeared. A gust of wind blew across the field, making the snow swirl around me. I shivered and took a step back. Something didn't feel right. The world, once so calm and peaceful, now felt different. Heavy. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the wind had made the snow look different, or the snow itself had settled in odd patterns. But as I stood there, staring at the growing footprints, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the tracks were alive. I took another step back, my eyes not leaving the ground. The footprints were now enormous, far larger than they had been before. It was almost as if the steps were increasing in size, as if something was growing right before my eyes. My breath hitched in my chest. I had to leave. I couldn't stay out here. Not with those tracks. I turned to head back the way I had come, but something in the snow caught my eye. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the field, I saw a figure. Standing still. It was too far away for me to make out any details, but the shape seemed human. I stopped, my heart racing. The figure didn't move. I squinted, trying to see it more clearly. But the more I stared, the more I realized it wasn't moving at all. It was just standing there, perfectly still, watching. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The figure was too far away to see clearly, but it felt like it was looking directly at me. Suddenly, the silence around me felt suffocating. The air grew colder, the snow more oppressive. It was as if the entire world had grown still, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as quickly as I had spotted it, the figure was gone. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The field was empty again, and the tracks were still there, growing larger by the second. I turned and began to walk faster, my mind racing. What had I just witnessed? What had I seen in the distance? But even as I moved, the sense of unease grew stronger, like something was following me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The snow around me, once calm and serene, now felt threatening. I tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the simple task of getting back to the house. But the footsteps in the snow were growing, and something inside me knew that whatever was making them wasn't finished yet. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching noisily in the snow. The weight in my chest was getting heavier with every step, the cold biting in my face, but it was nothing compared to the cold dread seeping into my veins. Every shadow, every flicker in the corner of my eye seemed to hold a threat, a presence that wasn't there before. I kept telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, that the footprints were nothing more than a weird coincidence. Maybe some animal had walked across the field, and I'd just seen it from the wrong angle, creating the illusion of growing footprints. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I kept looking back, glancing over my shoulder to make sure I was still alone, but the landscape remained untouched, as empty as it had been when I first noticed the tracks. Still, the feeling that something was wrong gnawed at me. As I walked, the snow beneath my feet seemed louder, more oppressive. It was as if the world around me was shrinking, the wind's whistle growing sharper, the air colder. But the strange thing was, I couldn't hear any birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing. The silence was suffocating, like the whole world had gone still. And then, a sound broke through the quiet, a soft crunch, faint, almost imperceptible. But I heard it. I stopped dead in my tracks, my body tensing. It came from behind me. My heart started pounding as I turned slowly, but there was nothing. The snow-covered field was as empty as it had been a moment ago. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sign of movement, any hint of what had made that noise. But there was only silence. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as the wind or maybe the shifting snow. I didn't have time to waste on my fears, but the unease was growing too strong to ignore. I started walking again, faster now, pushing myself through the thick, deep snow, but I couldn't escape the sensation that I was being watched. My breath came quicker, the cold now biting at my lungs as I picked up my pace, desperate to get back to the warmth of my home, away from the oppressive field. And then, I heard it again. A soft, deliberate crunching just behind me, like something was walking in my footsteps. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but again, the field was empty. My mind raced. Was I losing my grip on reality? Was this a trick of the wind? A figment of my imagination? But even as I tried to reason with myself, I knew deep down that I wasn't imagining it. There was something in the snow with me. The tracks, those massive, growing footprints, still stretched out behind me. They seemed so unnatural. I took a few steps forward, but the footprints now felt like they were following me, stretching out farther and farther as though something was keeping pace with me, growing closer. Suddenly, the wind howled through the trees, the air colder than before. The crunch of the snow underfoot seemed to grow louder, closer, until it was almost synchronized with my own steps. I stopped. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. The air felt heavier, the snow deeper, like it was trying to pull me down. My feet felt stuck, frozen to the spot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving around me, watching me from the edges of the field. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I dared not look to the side, knowing that I'd see something. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye sent a jolt through me. I turned quickly, my breath sharp, my heart hammering, but there was nothing. Just the still, cold expanse of snow stretching out before me. The silence returned, even heavier now, pressing on me from all sides. I couldn't stand it anymore. I broke into a run, my boots slamming into the snow, sending clouds of powder into the air. My body was cold, my legs aching, but I pushed forward, the feeling of something behind me never leaving, only growing stronger, more pronounced. And then I heard it. The crunching of snow. But it wasn't behind me anymore. It was ahead of me. It was coming from the center of the field, right where the footprints had first appeared. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. My eyes locked onto the spot where the tracks ended, the very center of the field, and there, in the distance, I saw it. A shape. A figure. It was standing still, facing me. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, standing motionless in the snow, just beyond the growing footprints. The same footprints that now seemed to stretch farther and farther, wrapping around the field in a strange, erratic pattern. The figure didn't move. But I felt its presence, its eyes on me. I could almost hear its breath in the still air, though no sound came from it. A creeping fear spread through me. My legs felt weak, as if they were no longer my own. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The figure slowly raised its arm. The motion was unnatural, jerky. As if it had never moved like this before, like it was learning how to move its body for the first time. It pointed directly at me. And in that moment, I knew I was not alone in the field. And whatever had made those footprints was coming for me. I didn't think, I just ran. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my chest burning with every breath as the snow whipped around me. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out every other sound. But that figure, the one I had seen in the distance, the one that had pointed directly at me, was in my mind, pushing me forward. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The footprints were growing, stretching behind me like they were following my every move. I could feel the presence of whatever had made them, closing in on me with each step I took. My boots sank deep into the snow, making it harder to move, but I pushed forward, desperate to get away. I was almost halfway across the field when I heard it again. That crunching noise, soft at first, then louder, closer. It was behind me now, each step coming faster, more deliberate. The sound was growing in sync with my own frantic footsteps, and the fear in my chest twisted tighter. I dared to glance over my shoulder. Nothing. But I could feel it. It was there. In the space between me and the horizon, waiting. Watching. The figure. The tracks. They were still there. And they were getting closer. I could almost hear its breath, soft and shallow, as if it were trying to hide from me. The closer it got, the colder the air became. It was as if the temperature had dropped even further, the wind biting at my skin like needles. I reached the edge of the field and almost stumbled in my haste. I had to get to the tree line, to the safety of the woods where the field's oppressive emptiness could no longer suffocate me. But as I turned toward the trees, I froze. There, ahead of me, standing between the trees, was the figure. It wasn't just standing anymore. It was moving. The tall, gaunt figure was slowly stepping toward me, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, its movements jerky, like something that hadn't been alive in years. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was hollow, empty, its eyes two dark pits. It didn't have a mouth, just a blank, distorted space where one should have been. It was staring at me. The air seemed to vibrate, an electric charge filling the space between us. The snow around it didn't settle like it should. It rippled, like the very ground was bending in response to its presence. The footprints had stopped growing for a moment, but the danger was clear. I turned and ran toward the trees, my breath coming in short gasps. The snow crunched underfoot as I pushed myself faster, but the figure was still there, moving with an eerie purpose. The space between us was closing. My boots slipped in the snow, and I stumbled, catching myself just before I hit the ground. I heard the crunching of snow again, but this time it wasn't behind me. It was to my left. It was everywhere. The figure was getting closer, its towering form moving at a disturbingly fast pace. And then I saw it, a movement too quick to catch fully. Another figure, smaller, darting across the field. I blinked, and it was gone, hidden among the growing tracks. I pushed myself harder, desperate to make it to the trees, but the snow seemed to pull me back. My legs felt weaker with every step, my muscles burning. The chill in the air bit at my skin, but worse than the cold was the feeling that I was being watched, surrounded by something that wasn't human. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft. Almost inaudible. Run. The voice was so faint that I couldn't be sure if it was real. It wasn't my own voice. It wasn't the figures. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in my mind as much as in the air. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the edge of the trees, my hands trembling as I grabbed a nearby branch for support. The figure was almost on top of me now, its footfalls shaking the ground, each step louder, closer. And then I felt it. A hand, cold as death, reaching out from behind me, brushing my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the trees, the dark silhouettes reaching up toward the sky. The figure was gone. I stood there, frozen, my body still vibrating with adrenaline. The snow around me was eerily quiet, the field behind me empty. But the footprints were still there. They were still growing, expanding across the snow, wrapping around the trees, stretching out far beyond where I stood. I didn't know if I was imagining it or if the world had truly shifted, but the trees around me didn't feel the same anymore. The once comforting shadows now seemed oppressive, as if the forest itself was closing in on me, trapping me between the trees. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows, expecting the figure to emerge at any moment. But nothing moved. The wind had died down, and for a moment everything seemed still, almost too still. Then I heard something else. A laugh. Quiet, distant, but unmistakable. And it was coming from within the trees. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. But the woods had become a labyrinth, the trees closing in around me, the tracks now following me in every direction, and the presence, whatever it was getting closer. I didn't know what it wanted. But I knew one thing, I wasn't going to stop running until I found out. I could hear the echo of my footsteps against the trees, the crunch of snow, but there was something wrong about the sound, distorted, as if the ground itself was swallowing the noise. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more the silence seemed to press against me. The laughter, quiet and mocking, rang in my ears, though it was faint, almost like it came from far away. But the woods were vast. The distance could mean anything. I tried to steady my breath, but my heart was racing. I had no plan, no way of knowing which direction I was going. The trees were too thick, too tall, and they seemed to grow closer, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The snow on the ground was deep, each step felt like a battle, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just beyond the reach of my vision. The figure from the field, it was still in my mind. Its hollow eyes, its unnerving, jerky movements, its silence. I couldn't escape it. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running before I lost myself completely in the forest. I had to stop. I had to think. I stumbled over a root, falling hard into the snow, but I didn't dare stay down long. I pushed myself to my feet and kept moving, my breath fogging in the air. I looked around, but the trees seemed to shift, their shadows bending in unnatural ways. The entire forest felt alive, watching me. The laughter, the faint, distant laughter, seemed to come from every direction. I tried to ignore it, but it was like a whisper in my mind, growing louder with every passing second. I froze again, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The tracks, they were here, too. Not just behind me anymore, but all around. They were everywhere. Small, large, and some that were impossible to even comprehend. Some tracks were thin, like the claws of an animal, while others were wide and almost too deep for their size. I followed the tracks, my pulse quickening. Maybe if I could follow them far enough, they would lead me to safety. Maybe they were left by something that could help me, something that wasn't trying to kill me. But the more I walked, the more the tracks twisted and spiraled around me, leading me in circles. I was running in place. Then I heard it again. A crunch, faint but clear, right behind me. I turned, my legs locking up in terror. A figure stepped into view. The same towering figure from the field. It was taller now, even more distorted, its limbs stretching unnaturally, the snow around it shifting as if it was warping reality itself. The air around it seemed to bend, as though the very atmosphere was becoming heavier, colder. It moved toward me, slowly, deliberately. I could see the empty sockets where its eyes should have been, its limbs stretched far too long. Its head tilted at an angle, the hollow face staring at me. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me seemed to close in, the trees growing more suffocating, the silence more deafening. The figure's footfalls were too loud in the quiet forest, its steps coming closer and closer. And with each step, the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. "Why are you running?" The voice was soft, impossibly soft, like it was both right beside me and far away at the same time. But it was clear. A whisper, deep in my ears, that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The figure stopped in front of me, towering over me with its long, spindly arms. It didn't move, just stood there, and for a moment, I thought it was waiting for me to speak. But the longer it stood there, the more I realized something wasn't right. Its face, those hollow sockets, seemed to be deepening, stretching further, pulling away from itself. As if it was becoming less and less human with every passing second. "Don't run," it whispered. "You can't hide from what you are." The words hung in the air like smoke, curling around me, choking me. I tried to move, but my legs were frozen, my body paralyzed with terror. The figure didn't seem to notice. Or maybe it didn't care. I couldn't escape it. Then, without warning, it moved. Its arms shot out, faster than I could comprehend, its long, bony fingers wrapping around my wrist. The grip was cold, so cold it burned, and I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the vastness of the forest. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed. "This is my place." The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and for a second, I thought I was falling. But I wasn't. The world around me was warping. The trees, the snow, they all seemed to bend and ripple like water, the space around me stretching and shrinking with every breath. The figure's grip tightened, and I felt my body being pulled forward, dragged toward it. I tried to pull away, but it was impossible. The strength in its grip was overwhelming. My muscles burned with the effort to escape, but the more I struggled, the tighter it held me. The trees around me were no longer trees. They were shapes, twisted forms, impossibly long, reaching out toward me with limbs like the figures. The forest had come alive, and it wasn't a place of shelter anymore. It was a trap. My vision blurred, my head spinning, and I felt my body being lifted from the ground. The snow beneath me was no longer snow, it was soft, like wet clay, and it was sinking. The figure leaned closer, its face stretching farther than I thought possible, the empty sockets staring into me, deep into my soul. "You belong here now," it whispered, its voice a jagged echo. "You're part of the woods." And then, with one final pull, everything went dark. I was lost in the woods, and I was never going to leave. I woke up in the dark. At first, I didn't know where I was. My head throbbed, my vision was blurred, and the air around me was thick, heavy, suffocating. I couldn't move. My body was stiff, as if it had been encased in ice. My limbs refused to obey, a sharp, numbing cold spreading through my muscles. The world around me felt wrong. The sounds, the silence, they didn't fit. Everything was too still, too unnatural. The weight of the darkness pressed down on me like a physical force. I could barely breathe. I forced my eyes open, but the sight before me only made the fear grow. I was no longer in the woods. I was somewhere else. Somewhere cold and empty. The ground beneath me was not snow. It was soft, dark, like wet earth, but it was wrong. It felt like it was alive, shifting beneath me, pulling me deeper into its embrace. I tried to move my arms, but I felt nothing. No sensation in my fingers. My chest tightened with panic. Then I heard it. The laugh again. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. It reverberated through the air, jagged and twisted, like something wrong with the world itself. It was a voice I knew. The figure. The one that had chased me, that had whispered to me. Its presence was now overwhelming, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, its presence closing in on me, its breath hot and dry against my skin. "You've come so far," it whispered, the voice like scraping nails against stone. "But you can't escape. Not now." I struggled harder, but the ground seemed to pull at me, sucking me back in. The darkness pressed in, and I felt my mind slipping, like the very air around me was clouding my thoughts, drowning my will. But then, through the fog of my panic, something changed. A flicker. A shape. A figure. It was faint at first, a shadow in the corner of my vision. But as I blinked, the shape became clearer. A figure, standing still in the distance, just at the edge of the darkness. It wasn't the towering presence I had seen before. It was different. Smaller. But just as disturbing. The features were blurred, like a smear across reality, but I could feel its eyes, its gaze, burning through me. It moved. Slowly at first, dragging itself toward me, its shape flickering in and out of focus. The closer it got, the more I could see, but the more I didn't want to. The face, if you could even call it that, was distorted, warped. It was like looking at a reflection in cracked glass. It wasn't human, and yet it was. It stopped just before me, the distorted figure towering over me, its body twisting, its limbs elongating unnaturally. It looked down at me, its eyes, two dark voids, staring into my soul. "You thought you could run?" it whispered, the voice now a deep, guttural hiss. "You thought you could escape?" I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat, choked by the darkness. The figure reached down toward me, its hand, long, twisted fingers, reaching for my face. The touch was cold, impossibly cold, like the hand of death itself. It felt like it was sucking the warmth from my skin. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure's fingers brushed my cheek, and I felt a jolt of ice shoot through my body. It was as if the touch was pulling me into something, pulling me deeper into its cold, empty void. "Don't you see?" it whispered, its voice now thick with malice. "You were always part of this. The forest, it never lets go." The world around me seemed to warp again, the ground trembling beneath me. The trees, once distant and silent, were now closing in. Their branches twisted into gnarled shapes, their shadows stretching like claws. The darkness around me thickened, pressing against my chest, suffocating me. I tried to scream again, but no sound came. The figure's grip tightened, pulling me closer. My body felt weightless, as if I was being dragged through the air. The cold was unbearable, and I could feel my strength draining away, like the very life was being sucked from me. The figure leaned in, its distorted face inches from mine. "You belong to the woods now," it hissed. "You are one with the darkness." And then, everything went still. For a brief moment, there was silence. The figure had stopped moving, and I could feel the ground beneath me, solid once again. My body was heavy, my limbs aching, but the darkness had receded, just for a moment. I could breathe again, but there was no escape. The woods, the figure, the darkness, it wasn't just here. It was everywhere. It had always been, and it was waiting for me. Have you ever felt like you were being followed? Not just a passing thought or a fleeting feeling, but something more? Something that gnaws at the back of your mind, grows with each passing second, and refuses to let go? That's what happened to me. It started small. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But when something keeps happening every single day, at the same time, it begins to feel more real, more sinister. Every morning, without fail, I would see the black car. It would appear just as I turned onto the street, a dark silhouette against the morning light. I'd catch a glimpse of it in my rearview mirror, just far enough behind to be unnoticed by most people, but close enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. It wasn't a huge deal. I thought it was just someone going the same way, or perhaps someone who lived nearby. But it didn't take long for me to realize it wasn't just a coincidence. The black car never passed me. It would follow, maintaining the same distance, always staying behind me, no matter which route I took. I told myself it was nothing, just a strange habit of a driver who had nowhere else to go. But that nagging feeling grew. It wasn't just about the car. It was the way it made me feel, watched, trapped, like I was being hunted. Each time I looked in my rearview mirror, I would see those headlights, fixed and unwavering. Every morning, without fail, it would be there. On the fifth day, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know who it was, what they wanted. I couldn't keep driving with that unsettling presence behind me, slowly eating away at my peace of mind. So, I did something I hadn't done before. I took a different route. I turned off my usual street, avoiding the main roads and taking a detour through the winding back streets, hoping that the black car would pass me by. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and for a moment, I thought I had succeeded. The headlights were no longer there. I felt a brief sense of relief wash over me. Maybe I had shaken it off. But then, as I rounded a corner, I saw it. The black car, parked up ahead. It had stopped right in the middle of the road, as if it was waiting for me. The engine was off, but it sat there, looming like a black hole in the morning haze. I hesitated, my foot hovering above the brake. What should I do? I thought about turning back, going the other way, but it was too late. The car was there, blocking my path. I slowed down, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I had to pass it. I couldn't turn around now. As I neared the car, I saw the silhouette of someone sitting inside. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel the presence behind the glass. I wanted to look away, but my eyes wouldn't leave the car. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Then, as if in response to my anxiety, the car's brake lights flashed once, twice. It was a signal. And then, before I could fully process what was happening, the figure in the black car moved. A hand appeared, long fingers reaching out toward the side window, and I saw something, a small, square object, fall into my peripheral vision. A letter. The figure's hand withdrew just as quickly as it had appeared, and the car slowly pulled away, disappearing into the haze of the morning. I froze, my mind reeling. What just happened? Why had they left me a letter? My eyes darted to the road ahead, but the black car was gone. It was as if it had never been there at all. I was alone now, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt heavier, darker. I sat there for a moment, too stunned to move. The letter was still sitting in my lap, the envelope now pressed against my hands. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Something about it felt wrong. Like opening it would somehow pull me deeper into whatever this was. I should have driven away. I should have thrown it out the window, forgotten about it. But curiosity got the better of me. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words typed in dark, bold font. It read, "We know what you did." I blinked. My breath caught in my throat. What did this mean? What did they know? There was no signature, no explanation. It was a threat. Or at least, that's what it felt like. But what could they possibly know? What had I done? I glanced around, my mind racing. There was no one in sight. The street was empty, eerily so. I had to get out of there, to leave this place behind. I shoved the letter back into the envelope and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I drove off quickly, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. The black car was gone, but that feeling, the sensation of being watched, lingered. It clung to me like a shadow, refusing to leave. The rest of the drive was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, even though I knew the black car was gone. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands sweaty against the steering wheel. Every little sound, the hum of the tires, the rustling of the trees, felt like a sign of something lurking in the distance, waiting for me. I don't know how long I drove, but when I finally reached home, I felt like I had crossed some invisible line. Like I was safe for now, but something was waiting for me to slip up. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to breathe. But even then, the unease didn't go away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows, made my heart race. I kept thinking about the letter, about what it meant. "We know what you did." The words echoed in my head, spinning around like a whirlwind. What did they know? And more importantly, who were they? I kept replaying the events in my mind. I had driven a different route that morning, hoping to lose the black car. It hadn't worked. The car had been there, parked, waiting for me. But then the letter. Why leave a letter? Why not confront me directly? It didn't make sense. I sat up in bed, the darkness pressing in on me, suffocating me. I grabbed the envelope from the nightstand, pulling the letter back out. I stared at it again, as if it might somehow reveal more information with each new look. But it didn't. Just the same typed words. No signature. No clue as to who had left it, or why. And then, a thought crossed my mind, a chilling thought that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. What if I wasn't meant to understand yet? What if the message was just the beginning? I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening was much bigger than I realized. The following morning, I didn't see the black car. It was as if it had vanished. I was relieved, but at the same time, a new sense of dread settled in. The absence of the car didn't comfort me. It was just unsettling, like the calm before a storm. I went to work, trying to focus, trying to push the whole situation out of my mind. But every glance at my rearview mirror, every passing car, made my pulse quicken. I couldn't help it. It felt like they were still watching me. That afternoon, when I got home, I noticed something strange. My mailbox, empty as usual, had a slight dent in the corner. It wasn't much, just a small indentation, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. I walked over slowly, the unease creeping back. I opened the box, half expecting another letter, but there was nothing inside. No envelopes. No messages. Yet, the feeling didn't leave. The same oppressive silence weighed heavily on me. But then, I noticed something else. A piece of paper, crumpled, wedged into the corner of the mailbox. It hadn't been there when I checked earlier that morning. I was sure of it. I took the paper out carefully, unwrapping it slowly, almost afraid of what I might find. The paper was folded in half, and inside was a simple message, written by hand this time, not typed. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "They're getting closer. Do not trust anyone." My breath caught in my throat. Who was leaving these messages? Who was watching me? I stood there for a moment, frozen, the paper still clutched tightly in my hand. Then, as if jolted by a shock, I realized something. I wasn't alone. I glanced around quickly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The feeling was back, the one I had tried so hard to ignore. Someone was watching me, and I didn't know where they were. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I leaned against it, breathing heavily, the fear rising in my chest. I wanted to call the police. But what would I tell them? That I was being followed by a black car, that someone was leaving cryptic messages in my mailbox? They'd think I was crazy. The paranoia was beginning to consume me. I couldn't trust anything. The messages had told me not to trust anyone, not to trust the people around me. Who could I trust then? The phone rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. I jumped, my heart racing. It was a private number. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the receiver. Then, with shaking hands, I picked it up. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. There was silence on the other end for a long moment, too long. Then, a voice, distorted, almost unrecognizable, came through the line. "You should have listened," it said, the words sending a chill down my spine. "It's too late now." The line went dead. I stood frozen, staring at the phone in disbelief. My mind raced. What did that mean? Too late for what? I wanted to scream, to lash out, but all I could do was stand there, heart pounding in my chest, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. Something was happening, something I couldn't control, and I was no longer sure what was real and what was just my own mind playing tricks on me. I went to the window and looked outside, as if expecting to see the black car again, waiting in the shadows. But there was nothing. Only the same quiet street, the same empty houses. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That I was being pulled deeper into something dark, something I didn't understand. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain: whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop. The days bled into one another. The messages, the calls, the black car, they were all becoming a suffocating reality I couldn't escape. I stopped leaving my house unless absolutely necessary. The paranoia was consuming me. Each time I stepped outside, I felt the air thick with eyes on me. It wasn't just my imagination anymore. The neighborhood felt different. The streets, once so familiar, now seemed foreign and foreboding. The trees, the houses, the pavement, they all felt like they were closing in, watching, listening. I couldn't shake the sense that everything around me was part of some larger, more insidious plan. But it wasn't just the environment. It was the people. I started noticing odd things. A neighbor I'd known for years, someone I'd casually waved to every morning, was now avoiding eye contact. A colleague at work, someone who'd always been friendly, began to look at me with something that wasn't quite suspicion, but something colder, darker. It wasn't paranoia. It was reality. One evening, I decided to go out for a walk, desperate for some normalcy. The air was frigid, but it was a relief. The cold felt like a break from the constant tension I had been living under. I walked down the street slowly, my footsteps crunching in the snow. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the ground, making everything feel eerie and stretched out of proportion. As I walked past the corner of my block, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a figure standing in the shadows. It wasn't quite a person, not fully. At least, not in the way I was used to. It was a silhouette, dark and indistinct, standing motionless by a street lamp. My breath caught in my throat. I had to force myself to look away, but my eyes kept drifting back to it. Every part of me screamed to run, but my feet refused to move. Then, as if it had been waiting for me, the figure stepped forward, moving silently into the dim light. It wasn't until it was almost too close for comfort that I could make out the details: tall, cloaked in something black, its face hidden by a hood. My blood ran cold. The stranger didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, watching me. It was as if it had always been there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to notice. I wanted to turn around and flee, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my legs locked in place by a mixture of fear and curiosity. The figure raised its hand slowly, and in it was a small piece of paper, the same type of paper as the ones I had been receiving. It held the paper out to me. I didn't know what to do. Should I take it? Would it bring me closer to the answers I was so desperately seeking? For a moment, the world around me felt like it had stopped. There was no sound, no movement, just the beating of my own heart in my ears. The figure didn't move, didn't urge me to take the paper. It was as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. I stepped forward cautiously, almost against my will, and took the paper from the stranger's hand. As soon as my fingers touched it, a chill shot through me, a cold that seemed to reach down into my very bones. I wanted to rip the paper from my hands, to throw it away, but something stopped me. I couldn't. It was like it was binding me to whatever game this was, whatever plan was being set into motion. The figure nodded once, sharply, as if satisfied with this exchange. Then, without another word, it turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving me standing alone, the paper still clutched in my hand. I stood there for a long time, the wind biting at my skin, before I finally opened the paper. The message was simple, but its impact was anything but. You can't hide from us. I dropped the paper immediately, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I looked around, but there was no sign of the figure anymore. The street was empty. The chill of the night seemed to close in around me, as if the very air had turned hostile. I ran home, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. I locked all the doors and windows, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't shake the sense that the eyes were still there, still following me. That this was only the beginning of something much worse. I couldn't stop thinking about the message. You can't hide from us. They knew where I was. They were always there, always watching. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape them. The terror was real. The black car, the letters, the strange figure, they were all connected. And I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. But one thing was clear, they were coming for me. And I didn't know how much longer I could outrun them. The days that followed felt like they were in fast forward. My routine, once mundane and comforting, was now fractured, like a cracked mirror with too many shards to piece together. The messages kept coming, one after another, each more cryptic and chilling than the last. The black car, though it had stopped appearing, still haunted my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, studying me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The silence was more terrifying than any noise could ever be. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window, made my heart race. Then, one morning, something changed. I woke up late, too late. The sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, casting long, tired shadows across my room. I rushed to get dressed, moving mechanically, the panic beginning to set in as I checked the clock and realized I was running behind. As I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair, I froze. On the floor next to my door, there was something. A small, plain black box, unmarked and inconspicuous, sat there, waiting for me. My hands trembled as I bent down to pick it up. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker as I lifted the lid, revealing an object inside, a simple, silver key. There was nothing else, no note, no message. Just the key. It was so ordinary that it seemed impossible for it to hold any significance. And yet, something about it felt wrong. My mind raced as I tried to think of where the key could fit, but nothing came to mind. No lock, no door in my house, no drawer I'd ever locked. I placed the key down on the kitchen table, my thoughts spinning in confusion. The room felt colder now, even though the heat was on. The air was charged with a sense of foreboding. That was when I heard it. A knock. Soft, deliberate, almost cautious, but unmistakably a knock. I froze. My heart thundered in my chest. The knock came again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one knew about the key, no one knew what had happened, except for... My breath hitched. They knew. The knocking continued, and the sound, as steady as a drumbeat, seemed to echo through the entire house. The door, my only barrier between myself and the unknown, suddenly felt fragile, as if it would shatter at any moment. I moved slowly toward the door, my steps careful, but my heart was pounding so loudly that I thought it might give me away. I peered through the peephole. No one was there. The porch outside was empty, as if the knocking had come from nowhere. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, with a sickening feeling, I turned back to the kitchen table. The key was gone. I didn't move for a long moment, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I had just seen. I was sure it had been there, right where I'd left it. But now, there was nothing. Just the empty surface of the table, mocking me with its emptiness. Panic clawed at my chest. My breath came in shallow gasps. I backed away from the table, suddenly feeling a profound sense of dread that I couldn't explain. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and ran out the door, not even bothering to lock it behind me. The street was eerily quiet, the houses standing like silent sentinels, watching my every move. I was aware of every step I took, every rustle of the wind. I didn't look behind me. I couldn't bring myself to. I ran, faster now, as if the world itself was closing in on me. Every corner seemed to hold another shadow, another threat waiting to materialize. I had no destination, no plan. Just a single thought: get away. I didn't stop until I reached the old park at the edge of town. It was always empty this time of day, the benches and swings frozen in place like forgotten relics. I sat down on one of the benches, trying to steady my breathing, trying to calm the racing thoughts that threatened to overtake me. But something was wrong. The air, once cold and crisp, felt stifling now. Thick, suffocating. I felt eyes on me again, that same oppressive sensation that I couldn't escape. I looked around, but no one was there. No one except for a figure standing across the park, just out of the light. It was hard to make out, just a dark shape against the backdrop of the trees, but I could feel it watching me. Waiting. I stood up, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs were frozen. I couldn't move. Then, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, like a predator closing in on its prey. The footsteps were faint at first, but as they grew louder, I could feel them reverberating in my chest, like a countdown. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost. The figure kept coming, its pace never faltering, its presence like a shadow consuming the world around it. And then, it spoke. The voice was familiar, but twisted, distorted, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. You shouldn't have run. And then, the darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up to the sound of my own ragged breathing, gasping as if I'd just surfaced from underwater. My body was frozen, stiff, my head spinning as I tried to orient myself. The air around me was heavy, thick with an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I was no longer in the park. the familiar walls of my house greeting me, but there was something off. The room was dark, the kind of dark that pressed against your skin, suffocating, as if the night had somehow infiltrated the very space. I sat up, disoriented. My heart pounded in my chest, hammering in a rhythm I couldn't escape. Sweat clung to my forehead, my hands trembling as I wiped them on my pants. The echo of the voice, the dark figure, "You shouldn't have run," repeated over and over in my mind. But I couldn't remember how I had gotten back home, or when the world had become this twisted. I glanced around the room, trying to make sense of my surroundings. Everything was in place, yet nothing felt right. The air was too still, the silence too complete. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and made my way to the living room. The harsh glow of the streetlights filtered through the curtains, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. I approached the window and peered outside, half expecting to see the black car parked across the street, its headlights staring back at me. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, empty street. I exhaled, a small sense of relief creeping in. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was all just a bad dream. But then, I saw it. On the porch, just beyond the window, lay a small envelope. I froze. I hadn't heard the sound of a car pulling up, no knock on the door, no one had come to visit. And yet, there it was, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. My stomach lurched with unease. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't leave it there, not knowing what it contained. With shaking hands, I opened the door, stepping cautiously onto the porch. The envelope was cold in my hands, the paper stiff, as if it had been outside for hours. There was no return address, no name. Just a simple, unassuming envelope. I ripped it open with an urgency I couldn't explain. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting on it familiar, too familiar. It was the same handwriting from the messages. The same precise, unnerving letters that I had seen over and over again. The message was short, but its weight was crushing. "We're already inside." I staggered back, almost dropping the paper. The world seemed to tilt beneath me, spinning as if reality itself was crumbling. Inside? What did that mean? Inside where? I rushed to the door, my heart racing again, my hands clammy. I checked the locks, locked. I checked the windows, locked. But the sensation of being watched, of being inside, was overwhelming. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt foreign, like I wasn't the one who belonged here. And that's when I heard it. A noise, faint at first, but growing louder. It was a soft scratching sound, like fingernails on the floor, moving in the distance. My blood turned to ice. It was coming from inside the walls. I pressed my ear against the cold surface of the wall, straining to hear through the thick wood. The sound was unmistakable now, like something was trying to burrow through, clawing its way closer. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't alone in the house. The walls were closing in. The scratching, the faint scuffling sound, grew louder with each passing second. Something, someone, was in the walls, moving, following me, waiting. It was as if they had been there all along, watching, listening, waiting for the right moment to make their move. I backed away from the wall, my breath quick and shallow, my mind reeling. I had to get out. I had to leave. But before I could make a move, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out entirely. Darkness. The scratching stopped. And in the silence, a voice, cold and mechanical, echoed from somewhere deep within the house. "It's time to play." My legs gave way beneath me. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. My heart thundered in my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. There was no way out. I wasn't being hunted anymore. I was part of it. The game, the fear, the darkness that had been following me. It had always been inside, waiting. And now it had found me. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. The game was over. Have you ever seen something that shouldn't be there? Something so out of place that it makes your skin crawl? That's how it started for me. It was just another ordinary night, or at least I thought it was. The kind of night when everything seems normal, but underneath, something is shifting, something waiting. I was tired, too tired to notice anything unusual, too tired to be worried. But as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe my own reflection messing with my mind. But then, the numbers appeared. I stopped mid-brush, my hand frozen in place. The digits were faint at first, almost like a shadow moving across the glass. But as I stared harder, they became clearer. 639, 527, 114. The numbers weren't just random. They were coordinates, specific points on a map. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't remember how long they'd been there. Had they always been there? Or had they appeared just now? I wiped my mouth quickly, but when I looked back at the mirror, the numbers were still there, etched into the surface, as if they had always been a part of it. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a mistake. These were coordinates, and something about them felt urgent, like they were calling me, pulling me towards them. I grabbed my phone, trying to ignore the sense of dread building in my chest. I opened the map app and typed in the numbers. The location popped up almost immediately. It was in the outskirts of town, a place I didn't recognize. A strange, almost forgotten part of the city. A place I would never go to, at least not on my own. But the coordinates didn't lie. They were real, and they were pointing to something. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. What if it was some kind of prank? Some twisted joke? Maybe someone had been in my house. But then why the mirror? Why those exact numbers? I couldn't ignore it. Something deep inside me told me I had to check it out. I had to know what was at that location. The feeling was overwhelming. The urgency was palpable, like a whisper in my ear, coaxing me forward. I stepped away from the mirror, the numbers still floating in my mind. I didn't know why I was doing this. I didn't know what would happen if I went to that place. But I knew I couldn't stop myself. Not now. I threw on my jacket, grabbed my keys, and left the house. The cold night air hit me as soon as I stepped outside, the chill biting through my clothes. But the cold wasn't what made me shiver. It was the feeling that something was watching me, something waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. As I drove, the streetlights seemed to blur into a haze, and the familiar roads started to feel unfamiliar. The closer I got to the coordinates, the more uneasy I became. The city was quiet, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. But every time I checked a rearview mirror, the road behind me was empty. I parked near the location, a narrow street that led to an old, abandoned building. The windows were boarded up, the brick walls crumbling, as if the place had been forgotten by time itself. I stood in front of it for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was doing here. My heart pounded in my chest, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. The building was silent. There was no sign of life, no movement, no sound except for the distant hum of the city in the background. I didn't know what I was looking for, or even what I expected to find. But as I stepped closer to the entrance, something caught my eye. On the wall next to the door, barely visible under the layers of dirt and decay, were symbols. Strange, jagged marks that seemed out of place, almost ancient. They weren't graffiti. They looked deliberate, like something had been carved into the stone. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold surface. The moment I touched the wall, a strange shiver ran down my spine. My heart skipped a beat as the symbols seemed to shift under my touch, rearranging themselves into a pattern I couldn't understand. But the fear didn't stop there. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable, darted just beyond the building's doorway. My pulse quickened, and my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I stepped back, instinctively reaching for my phone, but my hands were shaking too much to dial. The shadows seemed to follow me, lingering at the edges of my vision, never fully appearing, but always there. I wasn't sure what to do next. The air felt thick, heavy with a sense of something wrong, something that couldn't be explained. I had followed the numbers, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. The building, the symbols, the shadows, they weren't just signs. They were a warning. And now, I was in too deep. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadow that had darted past the doorway still lingered in my mind. I stepped back, but the sensation of something closing in on me made my skin crawl. I had crossed the threshold of curiosity, and now it felt like there was no turning back. The air was thick, and the hairs on my arms stood up, every sound amplified, every breath too loud. I turned to leave, but as I did, my eyes caught something in the dim light, a faint outline of a figure at the window. I froze. The figure wasn't clear, but I could feel its presence, its gaze on me. It wasn't human, there was something wrong about it. The way it stood still, almost like it was waiting for me to make a move. My heart pounded as I tried to steady my breath. Every instinct told me to run, to get away from that building and never look back. But something stopped me. The numbers in the mirror. The symbols on the wall. What were they trying to tell me? I stepped closer, my feet moving on their own. I wasn't sure why I felt compelled to keep going, but the pull was too strong. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for me. I could hear the faint sound of something scratching. It wasn't loud, but it was there, just beneath the surface of the silence. Like something, or someone, was trying to get out. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The inside of the building was as decrepit as the outside. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the air was thick with dust. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. But the strangest thing was the silence. The kind of silence that presses on your chest, making it hard to breathe. I moved cautiously, trying to make sense of the space. The faint scratching noise continued, and I followed it, drawn to a room at the back of the building. The door was slightly open, and I could see a dim light coming from inside. As I approached, the door creaked open on its own. My heart skipped a beat, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around and leave. I had come this far. Inside, the room was filled with old furniture, overturned chairs, broken shelves. But it was the walls that caught my attention. They were covered in symbols, hundreds of them, carved deeply into the plaster, forming a strange pattern that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I stepped closer, unable to look away. Some of the symbols looked familiar, others didn't. They were unlike anything I had ever seen. But there was one symbol that stood out, carved near the center of the room. It was a circle with an X through it, and in the center of the X, there was a small dot. The scratching sound was louder now, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Only the empty room and the strange markings on the walls. My mind raced. Was this connected to the numbers? The coordinates? I had to understand. I had to find out who or what had left these messages for me. But as I looked around, the feeling of being watched intensified. I wasn't alone. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a soft thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow. Methodical. They were coming closer. I spun around, my pulse racing. But there was no one there. The footsteps continued, though, echoing in the silence. The closer they got, the more I felt the ground beneath me tremble. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave. But my feet were frozen in place, rooted to the floor. I turned back to the wall, desperate to make sense of it all, when my eyes caught something else. A figure, standing in the doorway. A tall, dark shape, barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. It was waiting, watching. But for what? The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the figure stepped forward. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The figure stepped closer, the sound of its footsteps louder now, and as it entered the light, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. His features were indistinct, like a blur, as though my mind couldn't fully comprehend what I was seeing. His eyes were the most unsettling. Dark, hollow, like they were not quite human. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone made it clear that I wasn't supposed to be here. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't breathe. And then, in the silence, the figure reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper. The same kind of paper that had been in my mailbox earlier. The letter with no return address. The figure held it out to me. His hands were trembling, his eyes never leaving mine. I knew, without a doubt, that the letter was meant for me. It was the next step. The next message. But I also knew that once I took it, there would be no going back. The figure didn't move, but his hand remained extended, the paper trembling slightly, as if urging me to take it. The air was thick, each second dragging out like hours. I stood frozen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but no explanation seemed to make sense. I glanced down at the piece of paper in his hand. The edges were worn, like it had been handled many times before. There were no markings, no writing, just an eerie blankness that seemed to pull me in. I had already come too far. There was no turning back now. Without thinking, I took the letter. The moment my fingers brushed against it, the figure stepped back, vanishing into the shadows. The room seemed to exhale, and the air felt lighter, almost too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that letter was the key to everything. My heart was pounding as I unfolded the paper. I was alone now, and yet the silence felt even more oppressive. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to read the message. I stared at the paper in my hands. The words were simple, but they sent a chill through me as I read them aloud in the stillness. The mirror is watching. Your time has come. Follow the path you started. The words didn't make sense. The mirror? Watching? What path? I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but I couldn't stop myself from reading the message again. The mirror is watching. Your time has come. Follow the path you started. It was like a riddle, but it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a command. A command that had been waiting for me to follow. I felt the weight of the words pressing on me, and suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The scratching noise had started again, this time, louder, coming from the direction of the doorway. But when I looked, there was no one there. Just the same empty space. Was it all in my head? The figure, the symbols, the letters? Or was something far darker unfolding around me? I looked down at the letter again, but now it seemed to be changing before my eyes. The words were still there, but they were slowly fading, as if the ink was being erased by an invisible hand. Panic rose in my chest as I tried to read them again, but the letters were disappearing. I scrambled to make sense of it. What did this mean? What was the mirror? What was the path I had started? I couldn't think straight. The weight of it all was suffocating, and I could feel myself unraveling as the letter in my hands became nothing more than a blur of ink and paper. The silence in the room felt deafening. Then, the scratching noise stopped, and in its place, I heard something else, a low hum, almost like a whispering wind. It wasn't coming from the room, but from inside my head. Follow the path you started. The words echoed in my mind, growing louder. I turned around in a panic, but there was nothing, only shadows. Shadows that seemed to shift and pulse with an energy that wasn't there before. The mirror. It was in the hallway, just a few steps away from the room. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it felt like it was calling me. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed to leave, to run as far away as possible. But the words from the letter were undeniable. I had started something, and now I had no choice but to finish it. With trembling hands, I walked toward the hallway. The mirror loomed ahead, its surface dark and unnervingly still. I stopped just short of it, staring into the glass. For a long moment, nothing happened. My reflection stared back at me, blurry in the dim light, just like any other mirror. But then, something shifted. A movement, a subtle ripple, as though the surface of the glass was alive. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the strange sensation in the pit of my stomach. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just behind my reflection. It was me, but it wasn't. The reflection was distorted, twisted, as if someone or something was behind the glass, pressing up against it. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just my reflection, it was something else. A shadow that moved with its own will. I stepped back, horrified. The whispering sound from earlier intensified, swirling around me. Follow the path. The words weren't just in my head now. They were coming from the mirror itself, from the figure behind it. I took a deep breath, the tension in my chest almost suffocating. There was no going back. I had no choice but to follow the path, whatever it was. The mirror had drawn me in, and now it would show me what came next. I stepped closer to the mirror, feeling the cold air emanating from its surface. The reflection of the room around me started to warp, shifting and twisting like something from a nightmare. Then, as I reached out, my fingers brushed the cold glass. The world went black. The moment my fingers touched the mirror, the cold sensation spread through my body like an electric shock. My vision blurred, and for a split second, I felt as though I were falling into an endless abyss. My surroundings, the hallway, the dim light, everything vanished. The world dissolved, leaving only the sensation of weightlessness and cold. I gasped for breath, but no air filled my lungs. The silence was deafening, and the sense of disorientation was overwhelming. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, but the presence of something or someone was palpable, suffocating. My skin crawled. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything shifted. I was no longer in the hallway. I was in a place that was both familiar and alien, a world that seemed twisted and wrong. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. I was standing in a room, but it was nothing like the one I had left behind. The walls were cracked, covered in strange, faded symbols that seemed to shift while I wasn't looking directly at them. The floor beneath me was cold stone, uneven and jagged. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere weighed down on my chest. I took a step forward, my footfall echoing in the stillness. My breath came out in ragged gasps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me. But when I glanced around, there was nothing. I felt the pulse of fear rise in my chest, a primal instinct telling me to run, to escape. But the path had already been set. The words from the letter echoed in my mind, "Follow the path you started." And so I did. I walked deeper into the room, the flickering light from some unseen source casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. I could hear a low hum in the distance, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. It was rhythmic, like the beat of a heart. At the far end of the room, a door stood ajar. I couldn't tell what was beyond it, but something pulled me toward it, a compulsion stronger than my fear. With every step, the hum grew louder, more insistent. I reached the door and pushed it open, half expecting it to be locked, but it gave way easily. The air on the other side was colder, and the room was bathed in an unnatural, sickly light. My eyes adjusted to the strange glow, and I realized I wasn't alone. There, in the center of the room, was a figure. Not the same one as before, but something more human. A person dressed in tattered clothes, their face obscured by shadows. I couldn't make out their features, but I could feel their gaze fixed on me, piercing through the darkness like a weight pressing down on my chest. I froze. The hum had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. It came from the figure, but the words were incomprehensible, sounding like a language I had never heard, or maybe it wasn't language at all. It felt more like command. My legs felt heavy, my body trembling as I fought to stay grounded. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Every instinct told me to run, to escape this nightmare, but I was paralyzed, unable to move. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. My heart raced in my chest, and I took a step back, instinctively retreating. But as I moved, the air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. The room seemed to stretch, the walls closing in, the shadows growing darker. "You cannot leave," the figure said, its voice low and rasping. The words were clearer now, and they sent a jolt of fear through me. My feet moved on their own, stepping back further, away from the figure, but the room continued to shift, twisting around me. The walls closed in, the door that I had just entered now nothing more than a blur, disappearing into the darkness. I was trapped. "Who are you?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. Then, without warning, it raised its hand, pointing directly at me. "You," it said, and the word was filled with an eerie finality, "are the key." The floor beneath my feet seemed to shift, as if the very foundation of the room was changing. I stumbled, my legs giving way beneath me. I tried to stand, but the darkness had grown too thick, the shadows too dense. I was drowning in it. The figure moved closer, its face still obscured. But there was something in the air, a weight, a pressure. Something was coming. Something was about to happen. And then, as I reached out in desperation, I felt the cold hands of the figure on my shoulders. "The path has chosen you," it whispered. The world tilted, and the room spun out of focus. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The pressure was unbearable. And just when I thought I could endure no more, the world exploded into darkness. The blackness consumed me, a void that felt like it was swallowing every part of my existence. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My limbs were heavy, unresponsive, and I couldn't tell if I was even still standing. I wasn't sure where my body ended and the darkness began. But then, slowly, the blackness began to recede, the shadows breaking apart like clouds dispersing at dawn. Light, cold and distant, flickered into view. It wasn't the warm, familiar light of a room, it was something different, something harsh and sterile. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that I was no longer in the room I had left behind. I was somewhere else. I was standing in an empty street, the pavement cracked and uneven beneath my feet. The buildings around me were tall and imposing, their facades covered in grime, their windows shattered. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and an eerie silence hung over the city, except for the distant hum of something I couldn't quite place. The atmosphere felt wrong, oppressive, as though the very air had been tainted. I looked around, confusion swirling in my mind. How had I gotten here? What was this place? It looked like a city, but it wasn't the one I knew. The streets were unfamiliar, the architecture twisted in a way that felt unnatural. It was as if the city itself was decaying, rotting from the inside. I started walking, my steps echoing in the emptiness. The further I went, the more disorienting the place became. The buildings seemed to shift while I wasn't looking directly at them. I felt eyes on me, invisible, watching my every move. My heart pounded in my chest, but there was no escape. The streets stretched out in every direction, and no matter which way I turned, they led me nowhere. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the distance, barely visible in the fog that seemed to hang over the city. It was the same figure from the room, the one in the shadows, the one who had spoken the cryptic words. I didn't want to move closer. Every part of me screamed to run, to turn away from the figure, but something pulled me toward it. A force stronger than fear, stronger than logic, drove me forward. As I approached, the figure became clearer. It was no longer a shadow, but a man, tall, thin, dressed in tattered clothes, his face hidden beneath a hood. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence filled the empty street like a weight I couldn't escape. I stopped just a few feet away from him, my breath shallow, my mind reeling from the sudden sense of urgency. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why am I here?" The figure remained silent for a moment, as if considering my question. Then, he slowly raised his hand, pointing toward the sky. I followed his gesture, my eyes tracing the path of his finger. Above, the sky was dark, a sickly shade of purple that seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with swirling clouds that didn't belong. In the distance, I saw something that made my heart freeze, a vast, shifting shape, barely visible in the clouds. It was a massive form, something that defied description. A shadow, a presence, an entity that seemed to pulse and move like a living thing. Its shape was monstrous, inhuman, and it filled the sky with an oppressive weight. The figure's hand dropped, and he turned toward me, his gaze now visible beneath the hood. His eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to stare right through me. "This is the place where paths converge," he said, his voice cold and hollow. "A crossroads. The final choice. The one who follows the path must make the decision, whether to walk forward or retreat into the darkness." I swallowed hard, the words sending a chill down my spine. What decision? What path? "You're here because you've already chosen," the figure continued. "The path is set. The mirror showed you the way, and now you must see it through. But be warned, once you step forward, there's no going back." My mind raced. The mirror, the cryptic letter, the symbols, it was all connected. But what did it mean? What was I supposed to do here? I looked around, desperate for answers, but the city stretched out before me like a maze. What happens if I don't choose? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure's lips curled into something that resembled a smile, but it wasn't comforting. It was knowing. It was predatory. "You've already chosen," he said again, his voice softer now. "The mirror has shown you the way. You're not in control anymore. You never were." I took a step back, my pulse racing. My whole body felt cold, the realization sinking in like a heavy stone in my chest. There was no escape. This place, this nightmare, was my reality now. The figure was right. I had already stepped into it when I had touched the mirror, when I had followed the path. There was nothing left to do but face it. I closed my eyes, the weight of everything pressing in on me. When I opened them again, I was standing in the middle of the street, but this time I wasn't alone. The shadows were growing, creeping up the walls, converging toward me. The air grew colder, the sky darker, and the figure was gone. Only the whispers remained, filling the streets, the city, my mind. "The path has chosen you." The city began to close in around me, the darkness swallowing everything whole. And I understood. There was no escape from this place, no way back to the life I had once known. I was lost. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices that echoed in my mind. There was no turning back. The path had chosen me, and I had no choice but to walk it. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.